before I put my foot down and begin to stroll into the drama I built. And all unfinished beef, you will soon be killed. Put us together, it's like mixing vodka and milk. I'm going out blasting, taking my enemies with me. And if not, they scar so they will never forget me. Lord, forgive me, the Hennessy got me not knowing how to act.
Zero people in the house. 17 Celsius in the gulag tonight. The knees are busted. Anyway, we're gonna move to listening to one of my favorite channels called Horses.
They better have a riot gear ready, trying to back me and get rock steady. By the Mac 1 double, I touch you and leave you with not much to go home with. Or maybe it's the words from my man Killer Black that I can't say, so it's left an untold fact. Until my death, my goals will stay alive. Survival of the fit, only the strong survive. Yeah, we live in this till the day that we die. Survival of the fit, only the strong survive. We live in this till the day that we die. Survival of the fit, only the strong survive. We live in this till the day that we die. Survival of the fit, only the strong survive. Open your eyes and get wise. Look alive. 95, what up? You know what I'm saying?
No, I'm saying, no, I'm saying. You say no, no, I'm saying too much. No, I'm saying, no, I'm saying. Say no, I'm saying, no, I'm saying. The Ministry of No, I'm saying. Musty ass kush. Homie smell like a golden shower. Brutal. Musty ass kush, homie smelling like a golden shower. Yeah. Home is smelling like a golden shower. Yeah. What a fucking base text in sleep. Too much audio? I think so. Eastport. Kurwa, what's the situation here, huh? Oh no, kurwa. Fuck it, let's go Eastport. After that... Anyway, good time to start those tapes from horses, I think. Fuck it, let's listening to this. Speed, playback speed 1.10. Oh.
Horses band. Modern technocrats are mighty, brilliant, or exceptional because of their empires and their technocrats. This video. Mighty, brilliant, or exceptional because of their empires and their inventions. But I challenge this notion. These people are no more exceptional than ticks and leeches. Like these simple creatures, the technocrat minds operate only to satisfy a single need. They are not brimming with intelligence. Is it intelligent to corrupt an entire generation of youth just to grow your own enterprise? Is it brilliant to proliferate misinformation and sow hatred within a society? No, it is not. It is stupid, and those who act in this way are stupid people. They are the weakest, most pathetic sorts of humans evolution has ever produced. Through their stupidity, they have encouraged us to surrender our world. We know that social media use is bad for the mind, for attention spans, for self-confidence. This is all well known, well-trodden ground. But we seem to overlook the broader consequences at play. These are the consequences which have moved the world without us even noticing, and will continue to do so, as long as we remain ignorant to their existence.
Oh no, fuck.
Recently, a Reuters Institute report found social media overtook TV as the main news source for Americans. People no longer trust institutions, they trust personalities, like, for example, Joe Rogan, who is now one of the most influential figures in American media. His 2024 interview with Donald Trump has been credited for boosting Trump's presidential campaign more than any traditional network. While each side has their own take on that moment, it's clear that traditional media has failed us. When trust in institutions breaks, people follow whoever sounds right, even if they aren't the wisest voice in the room. That's why I think ground news is one of the most powerful tools for tackling one of today's biggest issues, the collapse of trust and transparency in our media. Unlike speckle, advantage, or clarity, not bad, not of technology against us, which since its inception has fractured our culture to its very core and pushed us onto a very dangerous road. The first iPhone, announced in June of 2007, was a harmless device. It was little more than a phone with a few useful everyday tools. But then Apple created the App Store. In 2008, when it launched, the App Store featured 500 apps. By 2013, there were over 1 million available. This was mostly due to Apple's introduction of SDKs, or software development kits. With SDKs, third parties could produce applications for the iPhone and sell them on the App Store. As with any sort of free market model, this introduced enormous competition. Large tech startups began pouring millions of dollars into their apps and settled upon an advertising-based model. Within this model, the longer an app held onto a person's attention, the more ads they would see and the more money the company would make. So there emerged a, now well-documented, race to manipulate users into maximizing time spent on the app. Children are easier to manipulate than adults, so they became the primary victims of these companies. This can be seen when we examine some early developments in social media platforms like Facebook. In 2009, Facebook introduced its like button. Twitter created the retweet feature. Suddenly, every post became gamified, their success quantified. At the same time, Facebook introduced an algorithmic newsfeed and the potential for viral posts emerged. The platform, which had originally been used for reconnecting lost friends, became something else entirely. It was performative, a source of validation, a game which one could win or lose. This era added about 3 hours of additional screen time per day for an American child. If we fast forward to today, Pew Research has found nearly half of teens use the internet, quote, almost constantly. In his book, The Anxious Generation, Jonathan Haidt points to the real-world effects of social media obsession. Young people do not spend as much time with their friends anymore. When they do, they allow their time to be interrupted by push notifications, and they signal that their phone is more important than their friendship. Young people get on average 192 push notifications per day. It is impossible to focus under this barrage, and so ADHD rates and symptoms have worsened in a causal way with the advent of social media. The people who run these companies use long-established psychological methods of coercion to keep young people returning to their apps. Of course, none of this is particularly groundbreaking. Quite the opposite. It is the same old song. Algorithms bad, retweets dangerous, teens using their phone too much. It is material which has been repeated so many times that even saying it here feels tremendously mundane. You see, often this conversation is centered around the individual. Phones create problems for a person, but we all live on this planet together, and we must all work with one another towards some better moment in time. As it turns out, this phone obsession is not just detrimental to the individual, it is pushing us entirely as a collective away from progress. The internet was once free information. That was fine for a time, but as Jordan Lanier pointed out in the book Who Owns the Future, this idea starts to fail when information becomes our economy. When the biggest movements of money take place for the sake of these social networks or the information on them, we can no longer use the word free. Now the stakes are higher. So too is the cost for this information. We often think of social media as an idle thing to do to pass time or perhaps waste time. It is the opposite of work. But perhaps this isn't true. When we are using social media, someone is reaping the rewards of our time. People are making money off of us, be them advertisers or the CEOs of these platforms. Every tap, every video, every swipe is building and improving these platforms and their algorithms. As we use social media platforms, we are quite literally building them. We are engaging then in a form of unpaid labor. This is a strange labor because it is a labor-leisure hybrid while providing the benefits of neither. We do not earn capital, nor are we allowing ourselves the benefits of idle leisure. It is during this sort of idle time when we reflect on and consider our truest selves. There is an oft-repeated joke about the frightful perils of those moments before a person falls asleep when they are alone with their thoughts. This joke comes from truth. It is at these kinds of moments, those of pure relaxation, when we are flooded by the most severe, serious, and consequential lines of thinking. Although daunting and not even always enjoyable, these machinations are crucially important in our self-discovery. Attending to push notifications and news feeds interrupts and even severs us from the beauty of empty mental clarity. It is mighty unfortunate to surrender an opportunity like this, to abdicate our own selves for the sake of rich men becoming richer men. And so, of course, this type of surrender has consequences.
What is that bullshit?
In his book, Stand Out of Our Light, author James Williams provides a metaphor for our modern social media landscape. Imagine you purchased a GPS device and put it in your car. You punch your desired destination into the device and it provides directions. But as you travel along its route and arrive, you realize it has taken you to a place entirely separate from where you asked. You needed to go to the grocery store, but you have arrived at a golf course or a movie theater. Perhaps once or twice you would tolerate this and chalk it up to a simple glitch. But imagine that over the course of a dozen instances, the same thing happened each time. The GPS would only take you to the wrong destination. You would, of course, never use that device again. Now, I ask the viewer of this video to consider their goals in life. Where would you like to go? What would you like to be? With those in mind, the question is now, does Facebook share that goal for you? Does TikTok, does Instagram, or Google, or Apple? Are these companies' goals aligned with yours? Certainly not. The goals of social media companies are not your goals. For whatever reason, we do not think about the story of our lives in the same way we think about physical space, like the GPS example. This is because companies like Facebook, Google, and Apple, as Williams suggests, are not only in the business of making devices. They are, too, in the business of making users. They engineer people to cast off their values and replace them with those of the company. The addictive nature of these devices and platforms trains our minds. Williams further points to what he calls starlight. That is, the ability to navigate towards one's goals and ambitions by only the stars in the proverbial sky of our minds and our souls. Social media trains us to chase immediate, short-term satisfaction, and in doing so, places clouds in the sky. It blocks our starlight, our ability to navigate by our own spirits. This changes a person's habits, but also their ultimate destination, their values. You begin to value things which have no value. You are conditioned to think that likes, reposts, followers are watermarks of fulfillment, so even when removed from the screen, you search for such mundane pleasures. Periods of rest, contemplation, and reflection are replaced by time spent chasing instant gratification on your phone or otherwise. Let us examine culture at large to see this. The functional details of political processes go mostly unnoticed, but when a liberal governor roasts Donald Trump on Twitter, the result is breaking news. In America, we have elected twice a president who has said and done things which violate universal moral values we all hold in the hopes of him fulfilling some short-term political promises. We shop from major corporations who we all know actively harm our planet and exploit laborers around the globe. Polarization is regarded as a major problem of our times. Perhaps, as Williams notes, we have become something much more profound than polarized. We have more than a disagreement about simple ideas. We have a division about who we fundamentally are as a people. The philosopher Rousseau cautioned against this, noting that as a population is misled by elites and subdivided into opponent groups, that population abandons their membership to an original, larger group. The modern manifestation of this could be a result of our lost starlight. Our goals, the grand narrative we seek to weave, those are the things which truly make us who we are. So as we lose track of them, we also lose track of our identities. Without an idea of identity, we cannot know what we share with one another. How can we possibly see mutual values if we can't even see our own? Instead of this connection to one another, we are now connected to the world outside of our world, to events we can do nothing about, and to people who are irrelevant to our lives. We are closer together than ever, and yet vastly removed from the very people which populate our day-to-day existences. It's like we've moved into a high-rise in a densely populated city. In theory, in abstract, we are closer to other people. But we do not even know our neighbors or the people we see every day coming to and from our homes.
Brutal. Yeah.
In our Western capitalist society, money follows money. In fact, most things follow money. Time, labor, resources, the massive amount of money chasing its own tail in the social media world rearranges our actual world. Given the money and power and social media networks, those who operate them effectively control the culture of our society. So it has become bizarrely quite normal to see tech leaders rubbing shoulders and kowtowing to a given present administration. These people bend at the waist and drop to their knees for the promise of fiscal growth at the hands of whoever is in political power. They give the president and his ilk the girlfriend experience. They say what they want to hear. They whisper compliments in the form of donations. They change their dress, speech, and selves for their clients, for the administration in power. All of this behavior takes place in a sort of modern era, elites-only gold rush. But instead of gold, these people seek data. They are obsessed with it because data produces capital. Indeed, it has been suggested that we are living in an era of dataism. In an article for the New York Times, Chris Anderson wrote, "If you asked me to describe the rising philosophy of the day, I'd say it is dataism. We now have the ability to gather huge amounts of data. This ability seems to carry with it certain cultural assumptions that everything that can be measured should be measured, that data is a transparent and reliable lens that allows us to filter out emotionalism and ideology, that data will help us do remarkable things like foretell the future. The data revolution is giving us wonderful ways to understand the present and past." Contemporary philosopher Byung-Chul Han has discussed this dataism in his work Psychopolitics. He notes that, in theory, big data promises a sort of liberation, a freedom from arbitrary notions about humanity. It is a truly objective glance at our species. But to make this reality, big data has morphed into something entirely unprecedented. As Han has suggested, big data, big business, and big brother have long existed as three separate ideas. But in today's world, big data has absorbed these other two, and the three together are now a singular entity. This entity spies on the consumer, like Big Brother. It harvests information, like big data, and it monetizes this data and trades it freely on a marketplace, like big business. For the purpose of this essay, we will refer to this entity as the big machine. Within the big machine, the lives of human beings, like you and me, have become commodities. Commodities have grading systems. Diamonds, corn, wheat, beef, these each have rigid classification systems whereby the individual piece is determined to have a poor or outstanding value. Now, thanks to the work of the big machine, humans have such a system, even if you do not know about it. Axiom is a data brokering company which trades the personal data of 300 million US citizens. The company has a grading system for individuals, in which humans are divided into 70 categories based on market value. In this system, the top market valued customers are put in a group titled shooting stars. People with low economic value are in a category literally called waste. And so, as Han notes, the big machine has created a new digital class society. Those with low credit scores, low income, or who otherwise are either useless or harmful to the market system are cast out of it. Those who are valuable are welcomed with open arms, valued, and lusted over. One of the groups who fiends over such data is, of course, politicians. They desire to get this dataist promised crystal clear, objective assessment of the public, so they buy data, with the help of donations from that same public, I may add. They tailor messages not just to groups or regions, but to individuals. Though we may wish to resist, we are often powerless in this fight. If a politician tailors his campaign to you precisely, and tells you everything you want to hear, why would you not vote for that candidate? And so I wonder where this fits into the concept of free elections. We are free to vote for whoever we please once our brains have undergone a targeted 24-month election cycle and our minds have been bent and squished and manipulated like pieces of clay. I consider those mice who are tested on and experimented on, who are given cheese each time they press a button. The mouse is certainly free to not press the button, but why wouldn't he? We are perhaps posed against the technocrats much more like this mouse than we may think. Psychologist Carl Jung was the first to identify the concept of the collective unconscious. On a personal level, we each have our own unconscious desires. That is, things we want or even need without really knowing it. These can manifest in behaviors, speech, or actions. The most clear examples are in children. One adolescent may misbehave upon the arrival of a newborn child in the household, stemming from jealousy. But certainly the child would not be able to identify that as the source of his misconduct. So too exists a broader collective unconscious. Humans in a culture act in certain ways, driven by things we may not recognize or understand. We may not even as individuals notice these broad patterns of behavior, but the big machine can. It's entirely possible that the big machine even possesses an understanding of ourselves, which is more accurate and objective than our own. Data mining unveils the scope of human actions. It draws lines between groups and the things they do. But certainly there is no reason for the big machine to share the results of these findings. Instead, it can and will use this data to generate capital and exercise power. Through the use of data mining, the big machine can break into our collective unconscious entirely undetected, and it can see truths which we ourselves cannot. It can thereby manipulate our unconscious and our behavior. It can change the trajectory of the society or the world without us ever knowing. The big machine is also a little
Big machine.
It offers ways for the individual to datafy their existence. How many hours spent sleeping, how many steps taken per day, what is your resting heart rate, and so on and so on. These things are useful and important, but much less useful are the ways we can datafy our lives through social media. How many likes did your last photo get? How many friends do you have? How many DMs did you get this week? These metrics reveal nothing to answer the very base question of who are you? In fact, they do much more than nothing. They actively push us away from discovering our true selves through the datafication of our lives. The previous concept of starlight is relevant here again. Added to that, as Han notes, data counts numbers. It does not recount, it does not reflect, it does not re-examine events at different times in life with earned perspective of living in the real world. The understanding of ourselves comes from exactly this process: repeated, serious consideration and reconsideration. Instead, we surveil our lives through the lens of hard data, making assessments and judgments upon ourselves like some nightmarish out-of-body experience. When we make these judgments and decisions based upon these numbers, it is no wonder they fail to provide peace or happiness. But still, we pursue further such decisions under the guise of self-improvement, when in truth we are just closing the door of a prison built with our own hands. Like Han suggests, we become both the guard and the inmate. There exists another flaw in the big machine, another fundamental gap in the understanding of the human experience. Han notes the big machine can tell us about A and B. It can tell us A causes B, or B has some determinate effect on A. It can tell us that as A goes up, so does B, or that B is reversely proportional to A. But it leaves out a third variable, that is C. That is the human spirit. It is the arena in which A and B exist. It is the chaotic, complex, unknowable human element which provides that landscape for all other things. This is why the big machine is so often wrong. It can only predict what is predictable. Consider the most cataclysmic events in the course of history, those that realign society, several of which we have experienced in the past 20 years. Consider more acutely the events which impact an individual on the most foundational level, those which change your life. These events are, of course, the most important that we experience as a society or an individual. The big machine cannot predict or prepare us for these things. So instead they occur, and the big machine is like a vulture which just feeds on the chaos they create. So the answer to all of this, one might think, is simple. Stop using your phone. The idea of stop using your phone sounds good, it sounds simple, but it pins too much blame on the individual. Older generations may say kids these days are on their phones too much. Those with harsh libertarian sensibilities might declare that you can just put down your phone. However, such ideas are formed in a vacuum, in an imaginary world which rejects the material realities of modern life. In some cases, anxiety-ridden helicopter parents need to know at all times what their children are doing. So they give them phones to keep the children safe. But the pedophiles and offenders of the modern world do not linger in parks and playgrounds. They are now, in fact, in the digital world, on the phone. Young people are immensely more susceptible to peer pressure. Friends and culture discuss social media discourse. Kids do not want to miss out on these things and be othered. While such a claim, a worry from a child, may seem melodramatic, it is not. Social media is a huge part of the modern youth experience, unfortunately, so there is some merit to the child's worry. This peer pressure mounts on parents. Children say, perhaps truthfully, they will be outcasts without a phone, and no reasonable parent wants their child to be an outcast. And so, as each parent gives into this pressure and buys their child a phone, each other parent feels the mounting pressure to do just that. We may also be tempted to say that parents should just send their kids outside. I suppose that is true to a degree, but the modern parental landscape does not really endorse this type of thing. If a child is running around by himself through a neighborhood or a wilderness, this can raise eyebrows. Suddenly, a neighborhood is awash with gossip about some mother being an irresponsible parent. Perhaps a particularly harsh individual even calls social services. It's a difficult situation. Not being a parent myself, I cannot expound too much on these issues responsibly, but the point may rest that it is difficult for both parents and children to shun social media. On top of this, billions of dollars and years of research go into making these apps. Do we really, genuinely, earnestly expect a 16-year-old child to defeat such an army? This is such a ridiculous notion that I don't think it deserves much more coverage. It is thinking from an old world. The child of today is exposed to everything adult with their phones, global catastrophes, pornography, lust, cruelty of man. Then they are simultaneously thrust into a classroom which suggests information and education exists in a tidy order with schedules, lessons, and subjects and structure. It should really be no surprise that this fractures the child's ability to parse information and process the world around them. If we earnestly want young people to thrive in a new landscape, we must give them the right tools. We must teach them to do so. As I type this, I can recognize two major discrepancies in this whole thing. The first is the fact that social media has done some good. Social media can, in theory, provide community and connection, self-expression, or even relationships, especially among those who may be marginalized due to race, ethnic, gender, or sexual background. But when we search for more hardline data rather than assumptions like these, we find a lack of evidence that there is any long-term benefit to social media use. Certainly, as Haidt notes, there is no wave of mental health currently sweeping across the developed world, quite the opposite. Perhaps social media can alleviate loneliness from a baseline of absolute zero, but this kind of company is far worse than the in-person relationships it continues to replace. This is indeed the broader point, not that social media is pure evil, but it is currently, on the whole, more bad than good. Many bad things have good effects. It feels good to snort cocaine. It may feel good to punch someone you don't like, but we would not say that cocaine or physical violence is good. I can also feel the shouts of the audience. They remind me that I, in fact, am the emblem of participation in this social media landscape, which I simultaneously deem so harmful. What can I say to this? What argument can be made? What excuse can I find? Of course, the answer is really none. But I do think when it comes to these platforms, we can either work for them or they can work for us. My hope is that I can produce things which encourage the latter, which encourage people to consider social media, the world within it, and the world without it. I'm extremely hopeful where the future is concerned. In the past, large-scale societal issues have been corrected. Everyone used to smoke cigarettes, now they do not. Civil rights movements have made massive gains, even if there is work to be done. Despite our current environmental issues, collective green action has won countless victories. There are many feasible solutions for change. The government could take action, could establish some oversight. They could, as some have suggested, raise the online adult age from 13 to 16. There are two cultural issues which could be sorted. Perhaps we should reassess the idea of childhood independence. Parents often fear letting their children run free in the world from the consequences on the child or the social consequences on they themselves. If we are being profoundly optimistic, a practice which I think is not always misguided, we could look at the ever-swinging pendulum of culture. Perhaps with Generation Alpha or future generations, the prospect of being always online will simply be regarded as uncool and elderly. Perhaps these young people will, on their own accord, shun social media. The fact is that media and life within it has changed. Everything is different now. Old people in power are incapable of understanding the depth of that change. Young people, however, are powerful. They are smart. We must ignore the ongoing generational shouts that declare the youth to be perpetually stupid. These shouts are arrogance and cynicism. They are the rot of age on stale minds. It is and always has been the youth who perceive the world most accurately, and it is the youth who fuels changes. In time, the youth of today will control the world of tomorrow. They will not, must not, forget the harsh indecency enacted upon them, upon their world, by current-era technocrats. The youth can be more than idle participants in the digital playground. They can take it upon themselves to rip the land apart and rebuild it into something which does not exploit them, but fills them with joy.
Kurwa. Okay, let's play another one.
In the 1800s, British explorers were starting to make frequent trips to the independent nation of Hawaii. Seafaring Brits would go sail the Pacific and basically make pit stops in Hawaii. Eventually, these visitors included American Christian missionaries. The Thaddeus was the first ship carrying missionaries from America to Hawaii. These missionaries were part-timers, that is, they all had vocational skills outside of spreading their gospel. They were physicians, teachers, printers, and farmers. So a lot of them used those skills and stayed in Hawaii. Regardless of my, ours, or your feelings about missionaries in general, they were decently received by the Hawaiians. That is, they lived amicably enough among the native people. Some of the Americans who came to Hawaii just wanted to make people Christian. but others wanted to make money. Sugarcane had been grown on a small scale in Hawaii for hundreds of years. Americans noticed this and realized that the land was ideal for sugarcane. Meanwhile, in America, it was a huge cash crop, so these Americans started growing sugarcane in Hawaii, and a lot of it. Americans began using up huge swaths of land in Hawaii for their sugarcane and fruit plantations. You could say this was when American colonization of Hawaii really started, even though any formal changes in government would come much later. And it's hard to overstate just how huge sugarcane farming got in Hawaii during the 1800s. When the Americans arrived, private land ownership did not exist in Hawaii. But in 1848, the King of Hawaii enacted the Great Mahele, a piece of legislation that redistributed the lands of Hawaii. The Great Mahele is regarded as one of the two most significant events in Hawaiian history, and we'll talk about the other one later. But if you want to learn more about the Great Mahele, and there's a lot to learn, you can watch a lecture at the URL in the video description below. The results of the Mahele were widespread and complex. Even today, its impacts are still being debated by scholars. But a definite, significant result was this. The Hawaiian government sold a whole lot of land to American sugar and pineapple plantations. If you wanted to be very generous, you can make the argument that these businessmen were not Americans, they were Hawaiians. Despite being ancestors of Americans, they were actually born in Hawaii. But as later events will reveal, their allegiance was decidedly to America, not Hawaii, and certainly not Hawaii's native people. After the Great Mahele, sugar and fruit companies basically had a stranglehold on Hawaii. The industry was tightly controlled by descendants of Americans, concentrated in a few corporations known in Hawaii as the Big Five. These 5 companies together gained control over huge parts of the Hawaiian economy, including banking, warehousing, shipping, and importing. Eventually, every good that came and went from Hawaii passed through the hands of the Big Five. Most of the island's residents were also, in some way, employed by the Big Five. So these few companies were essentially running Hawaii by this point. But essentially running Hawaii wasn't good enough. They wanted to officially run the country. So rich plantation owners formed the innocently titled Citizens Committee of Public Safety. This was basically a political action committee working to advance their own interests in Hawaiian society. But unofficially, it had much more radical plans. The committee formed a secret society called the Hawaiian League. There were no public records kept of the Hawaiian League, and members were strongly discouraged from discussing the group in public. The Hawaiian League wanted to overthrow the Hawaiian government and annex the nation to America. To help this happen, the Hawaiian League came into control of the Honolulu Rifles, a local militia based in Hawaii. At the time, the ruler of Hawaii was King Kalakaua. The Hawaiian League used the Honolulu Rifles to force the king to sign a new constitution. This document is sometimes called the Bayonet Constitution, because it was quite literally signed at gunpoint at the end of bayonets. The document granted suffrage to foreigners, generally Americans, by linking the right to vote with property ownership. Americans owned most of the property, so by voting together, they could basically make whatever laws they wanted in Hawaii. But then King Kalakaua got sick and died. This left his sister, Queen Liliuokalani, as sole ruler of Hawaii. Her goal was to restore power to the Hawaiians by eliminating the Bayonet Constitution and creating a new one. This idea was widely supported by the Hawaiian population. Of course, it would have taken the newfound power from the American businessmen, who, by the way, were not even citizens of Hawaii. But when the Hawaiian League heard of this, it was pretty much go time. They had the numbers and guns for a proper military overthrow of the monarchy. So one day, that's exactly what they did. The League held a mass public meeting on January 16th to denounce the Queen and garner support for a coup. And this was no small group. Over 1,000 people attended, most of them white American males. John L. Stevens was stationed in Hawaii at the time as the American minister to the Kingdom of Hawaii. The Hawaiian League told Stevens that there would be a coup the next day and American descendants in Hawaii wouldn't be safe. So Stevens summoned U.S. troops from the nearby USS Boston to land on Hawaii. The next day, 162 armed sailors and Marines came ashore. They were under orders of neutrality, never fired a shot, and did not enter the Hawaiian palace. However, this type of intimidation prevented the Hawaiian royalists from defending themselves. If the Hawaiians did anything, they'd just get killed by well-armed American soldiers. The Queen, of course, realized this. So as the Queen's ministers were in their police station, the Hawaiian League took over the government building without any resistance. From there, the League similarly took over other important buildings and the Queen surrendered. The Hawaiian League had officially, successfully, and with the help of the U.S. military, overthrown the government of Hawaii. But remember, this was only part of their ambition. They still wanted to get America to annex the nation. Sanford B. Dole was a lawyer living in Hawaii at the time. He was radically pro-West. He wanted Hawaii to become as American as possible, so the Hawaiian League instated him as the first Hawaiian president. Dole really wanted to make Hawaii a state. He thought that by becoming part of the Union, American-owned sugar and pineapple plantations in Hawaii would compete with those in the continental U.S. Dole tried to make this happen, but there was one huge problem. Grover Cleveland was U.S. president at the time, and he was very anti-imperialist. He was furious about the U.S.-sponsored coup. After ordering a full investigation into the incident, Cleveland discovered that U.S. troops had acted without orders from Washington to overthrow a sovereign government. Cleveland made an official recommendation to Congress that the Queen be reinstated, but Congress denied this measure and Hawaii was left in limbo. Sanford Dole bided his time until America elected William McKinley as its next president. After McKinley's election, his Republican Party called for the annexation of Hawaii. The Hawaiian people petitioned for a popular vote to decide the matter, but those calls were entirely ignored. William McKinley argued that if the U.S. did not annex Hawaii, then Japan would take over the islands. Hawaii officially became a U.S. territory in the year 1900. While not full statehood, it achieved what Dole wanted, more advantageous positioning in the U.S. marketplace. So his family's next move was no surprise. They founded the Hawaiian Pineapple Company, which later became the Dole Fruit Company. So it was technically Sanford Dole's cousin, James Dole, who founded the fruit company. But let's not be naive. Sanford spent nearly a decade positioning Hawaii to be more advantageous to fruit and sugar companies. It would be quite a coincidence that the year after he succeeded in doing so, his cousin just happened to go into the fruit business. James Dole's entire strategy revolved around the commodification of Hawaiian culture. He believed that by exploiting the culture, he could brand pineapples as exotic luxury items and appeal to American consumers. And that's what he did. For decades, Dole Fruit Company exploited Hawaiian culture and people to sell pineapples. They branded Hawaii as a paradise free of work and full of leisure-loving locals. Dole pineapples were sold as truly Hawaiian. Their products featured images of Hawaiian people, all smiles. At the same time, Dole had, just years prior, stripped these same people of their lands with only low-paying, hard labor jobs as compensation. But it worked. Today, Dole is a multi-billion-dollar company, and Hawaii's true history largely goes ignored by Western media and schooling. In 1993, Bill Clinton signed an official apology to the people of Hawaii for overthrowing their government 100 years prior. But this legislation was just that, an apology. He didn't return any of their land, sign any protection for native Hawaiians, or really do anything besides say, "Sorry guys." However, the fight isn't over. In recent years, there have been strong pushes for the US government to actually recognize native Hawaiians and restore the country's independent sovereign government. In 2016, the Department of the Interior put together a plan to make that happen, or at least something like it. Unfortunately, reinstating a government is a hugely complex, controversial issue. Some Hawaiians want to be recognized in the same way that Native Americans are and given those same benefits, a sort of government within a government. But the risk of being blunt, that hasn't really worked out well for Native Americans. So others argue that recognition isn't going far enough. The overthrow violated international law, so the new government of Hawaii was never legitimate in the first place. These people say recognizing Hawaii as a reservation would just be lip service and a continuation of an illegal U.S. occupation. Family kind of does too. Hannah records this quaint farm life and publishes it all online to her combined 8 million followers. The videos show the Nealman's life on this adorable, modest homestead. Hannah spends her days baking rustic loaves of bread from scratch or hand-milking cows with her children. It's very pastoral and very romantic. The videos seem to say, hey, we live in an old, rundown farm and we make the best of what we have. It's all genuinely quite charming. Except Hannah and Daniel are billionaires. Daniel's father founded JetBlue Airlines, and Daniel is the heir to that empire. This fact is left out of all of their videos, I would argue, quite conspicuously. I don't think the Nealmans are pretending to be poor, but they are co-opting poverty as an aesthetic, or at least some bizarre, fictional version of it. Poverty in the modern world is not baking bread or milking cows, and we'll talk about that later. But this video is not about putting Hannah and her family on blast, because A, who cares, and B, the Nealmans are not the first rich people to treat poverty like a fashion statement. What they are doing is not unique at all. Rather, it is a symptom of a much more popular phenomenon that has been around for a really long time. Longer than you probably think. Today, though, beamed through social media by influencers and celebrities alike, it all feels especially depraved. Why is this happening? Why is being poor the new being rich? Marie Antoinette was the last queen of France before the French Revolution. Goes without saying she was extremely wealthy. Indeed, she was known for her opulent lifestyle. During her reign, Marie Antoinette built what is called Le Hameau de la Reine, or the Little Hamlet. She recruited workers to create a modest village for her, basically in her backyard. It was designed to look like an everyday peasant village, complete with farm animals like goats, cows, and sheep. Altogether, the queen built 5 brand new buildings. These cottages mimicked those found in the idyllic French countryside. Of course, without all the dirt, starvation, and rampant deadly disease. One of the cottages was made for the queen and her immediate attendants, while the others housed the peasants who actually worked on the farm. If stories are to be believed, Marie Antoinette often found herself bored and or frustrated by the trappings of royalty. Okay. When the world just got to be too much for her, the queen would go to her farm and dress up like a peasant. Literally. Marie Antoinette would change from her royal garb into peasant clothes, into a plain muslin dress. She and maybe some friends would milk cows, tend gardens, and play with animals. After a few days of make-believing she was poor, Marie Antoinette would return to her royal lifestyle. In fairness, this story isn't really accepted as fact by historians. It's something like an urban legend. But the fact that it has persisted tends to indicate a degree of plausibility. It feels like something that tasteless, out-of-touch rich people like Marie Antoinette would do. Because it is. We don't have to go that far back in time to find it happening. Kim Kardashian recently did a photo shoot where she dressed up like a milkmaid. This is eerily similar to the tales about Marie Antoinette in a way that is simultaneously repulsive, dystopian, and wholly unsurprising. The luxury brand Balenciaga sold dirty shoes with holes in them for $2,000. Retail giant Urban Outfitters has said their aesthetic is, quote, upscale, homeless. All of this is super weird and feels kind of out of touch. The whole fake poor thing can also be seen in the entire phenomenon of van life. I'm sure there are plenty of van lifers that are not rich, but I know, and everyone else knows, that a lot of van lifers are just 20-somethings who came from money. I mean, these vans can cost north of $100,000. Van lifers have basically just gentrified homelessness. I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with living in a van, but it is a very obvious example of the rich pretending in some way to be poor. Rich van lifers can be poor without the hard parts about actually being poor. They have safety nets. They don't have to struggle to eat. When rich people live in a van, it's cool. When poor people do it, they're seen as somehow less than. But all of this gets really boring. Who cares what rich people do? Sitting around complaining about it, rattling off chief offenders, is not a worthwhile use of time. What is really interesting, though, are the reasons why rich people love to act poor, and what it says about our world. Perhaps the number one way to show off wealth has always been some form of exceptionalism. The rules of society don't apply to a person because they are wealthy, and they want to broadcast that. Look at this huge house, look at this expensive car. I have all of these things, and they make me different from regular society. I am rich, therefore I am exceptional. The standards and expectations of real life do not apply to me. You can tell by the way my life is, by the things I own. So, keeping that in mind, today we live in a world inundated by, well, everything. We are expected to both produce and consume as much as possible. Our entire lives revolve around work, which is just a way to produce goods or services, or more accurately, money. The first thing we ask people is what they do for a living, which is basically just another way to ask what they produce. Your level of production is perhaps the most valued trait in modern Western society. So what if you can go live on a farm? What if you can spend all day producing a single loaf of bread, and that's it? In a world driven by productivity, producing nothing is the most exceptional, elite thing you can do. Information overload was once something we struggled with. Now it's just something we must endure in order to survive. We have to be constantly plugged in. We can't do our jobs. We can't be connected to our families or our loved ones. Without a constant stream of news, we become ignoramuses who don't pay attention to the world around us. But if you have enough money, you have the privilege of escaping this reality. You don't need to deal with information overload. You can just bake your bread on your farm or whatever. Pop singer Ed Sheeran famously doesn't have a phone, but I guarantee you he paid someone to have a phone for him. Being completely removed from the world around us has always been a hallmark of the rich. But today's world looks very different than it once did, so being removed from it does as well. Perhaps people are so fed up with the rat race that winning it is no longer aspirational. Instead, ducking out of it altogether is the pinnacle of success. Today there is a growing voice of disdain for the ultra-wealthy. Anyone can hear it, whether you are part of it or not. Types of media being produced, the rise of Bernie Sanders, the general discourse in America. People don't like the rich in the way they perhaps used to. Every week, the rich are being blamed, maybe deservedly, for many of the problems in our society. But by pretending to endure a struggle, the rich hope to gain two things: acceptance and respect. When celebrities or influencers dress up like milkmaids and play farmhouse, they are saying, hey, I'm like you, I have struggles, things are hard for me. So the idea is that regular people will accept them. The irony here, of course, is that these people are so far removed from poverty, they have no clue how to even imitate it. The contemporary struggle does not take place in a farmhouse. By pretending to have struggles, the rich also tap into the idea of the world as a meritocracy. Rich people show themselves struggling with the implication that they deserve their wealth because they worked hard just like everybody else. The hope, perhaps, is that this will produce a respect and so portrayed artwork that earned the rich their wealth. Last year, when asked what advice she had for women looking for success, Kim Kardashian said they just needed to get their asses up and work. This was obviously misguided advice, but was also a message to viewers that, hey, look at me, I've worked hard. You should like me, I deserve what I have. Maybe, maybe not. But the point remains, this is incredibly bad advice that feeds into an absolutely bogus narrative, and we will come back to that soon. So what? Who cares? Rich people can do whatever they want with their money or their influence. What difference does it make? Well, it's just ethically bankrupt to dress up as poor people for a day. It's gross on a moral level. Beyond that, it is tremendously important for people to have some genuine grasp of other people's experiences. Fictionalized, Pinterest-ready poverty is not a true reflection of real poverty. Choosing to live simply is not the same as being forced to. Performative poverty is a farcical, misleading representation of a very real struggle that millions have to endure every day. High-profile rich people have an enormous amount of cultural influence. When they romanticize poverty, it makes poverty seem like a non-issue. It makes people think that struggling perhaps isn't so bad. Perhaps it's kind of cool. At the very least, it causes the widespread acceptance of poverty. And so there's no large-scale interest in doing anything about this huge problem. This also diminishes attention on all of the issues that fall under the umbrella of poverty. When it becomes cool or even normal to be poor, no one really does anything about systemic poverty. You see, the reality is, poverty isn't a necessity. Our society doesn't need to have people who literally starve to death. We have a lot of money in the Western world. There are things we could actually do. But as long as we accept poverty as part of our society, it simply isn't a problem. It's just built in. When the uber-rich romanticize poverty, they often paint a picture of a lower-class person working hard and overcoming their circumstances. This is possible, but it's not universally possible. There are many, many poor people who work hard every day and will still be poor forever. To pretend otherwise is to absolve a system that has put millions of people into poverty. This narrative puts too much responsibility on the individual and not enough culpability on the world and circumstances around that individual. Without culpability, there can be no change. We should not forget how depraved poverty is as a concept. Humans should not have to struggle so much just to exist in society. People shouldn't have to live that way. People deserve to be happy.
Not gonna work. Let's go. Fuck. And we're gonna go down. So far it's climbing. Okay. Wow, that's a very high point. Shit. Oh no, we are fucked. This is the end. Oh. Wow, shortcut, first time. Shortcut.
Check out the horse's store. In its context, we can discover uncomfortable truths about the past and present of America and the American dream. Of course, before we see how Fitzgerald dismantled it, we would do well to identify the American dream itself. This term, the American dream, was not actually coined until the early 1930s, about 7 years after Fitzgerald wrote The Great Gatsby. But the myth, the narrative, had existed for centuries without such a tidy name. The American dream is said to be the greatest dream for the individual. It tells us that even those born at the bottom may rise up to the pinnacle of society. They can own a house, impact the nation, and move mountains. This is usually achieved through some combination of tenacity, talent, optimism, grit. For Fitzgerald, this had all decayed into a propaganda. It was a former truth, long distorted by the realities of American society. To come to his conclusion, Fitzgerald simply examined the world around him. Now, Fitzgerald was not a philosopher or a social critic. He was a writer of fiction. So rarely has he expressed this disdain in a pointed, non-fictional way. But if we examine the cultural climate of his time and the works Fitzgerald studied, we can see how the author reached his rather pessimistic conclusion. Fitzgerald wrote The Great Gatsby in the early 1920s at a time of economic revolution in America. After the First World War, the U.S. economy fell into a depression. Unemployment rose to nearly 12% in 1921. The price of crops surged to problematic, unattainable highs. But these economic woes swiftly turned around. Unemployment dropped to 2.4% by 1923. The nation's GDP increased by 40%. Annual income per capita surged by 30%. The scholar Robert A. Devine has said, "The American people by the 1920s enjoyed the highest standard of living of any nation on earth." In the early 20s, the American economy grew by 7% per year, with the country responsible for 50% of the world's industrial output. Amidst times like these, the American dream was as alive as ever, but Fitzgerald and his contemporaries perceived danger. The author Oswald Spengler published a book called The Decline of the West in 2 volumes from 1918 to 1922. Read today, the book is massive, confounding, and provocative to the point of being self-indulgent. It is at best a bore, and at worst, vaguely racist. But it was a product of its time, and indeed it became one of the most influential works in the era. Fitzgerald once wrote in a letter, "I read Spengler the same summer I was writing The Great Gatsby, and I don't think I ever quite recovered from him." We cannot say with certainty which portions of the book resonated so intensely with Fitzgerald, but the overall narrative of Western decomposition sits at the heart of The Great Gatsby. Spengler wrote, "As soon as the market has become the town, it is no longer a question of mere centers for streams of goods traversing a purely peasant landscape, but of a second world within the walls. The true urban man is not a producer. He has not the inward linkage with soil or with the goods that pass through his hands. He does not live with these, but looks at them from outside and appraises them in relation to his own life upkeep. In place of thinking in goods, we have thinking in money." This idea of thinking in money is crucial to The Great Gatsby, but it is like the clothing the book wears. At the soul of Fitzgerald's novel, we have a more profound disillusionment with the American dream. With that in mind, it is time to begin our investigation in earnest. Narrated by a man named Nick Carraway, The Great Gatsby follows its titular character, James Gatsby. Born impoverished, Gatsby pursues a romantic, idealized life which is represented by his ostensible love for a wealthy young woman named Daisy. Essentially, Gatsby tries to become the old money sort that Daisy desires. Gatsby earns a fortune as a bootlegger, reacquaints himself with the now married Daisy, and tries to earn her favor as a very new man. This could-be romance is the driving point of narrative action in The Great Gatsby. But we must understand Gatsby himself if we are to discover the true meaning of this romantic entanglement. J. Gatsby was born as James Gatz in North Dakota. It would be very blunt to say that Gatsby yearned to be rich. More accurately and more sincerely, he yearned to be what he was not. According to the narrator Nick, his parents were shiftless and unsuccessful farm people. His imagination had never really accepted them as his parents at all. It is precisely this imagination which typifies and motivates Gatsby, this rejection of his past. This too can be said of the American dreamer, as suggested by William Kane in his paper, American Dreaming, Really Reading The Great Gatsby. Kane notes, "The greatest American dreamers say yes, but their power comes first from saying no. The American dreamer is propelled by the dreamer's disavowal of his or her past, the refusal to be that person. I cannot accept these parents, this upbringing. Who I am is intolerable to me, and I will not endure my existence in this paltry life. I will become someone else. Indeed, this is Gatsby's goal. Already we can begin to see that Daisy is not exactly the love of his life. His romantic interest in Daisy is just one facet of Gatsby's larger goal. She is his trophy for his lifelong quest. Fitzgerald's first blow at the American dream comes when Gatsby's career is revealed. He is a bootlegger who sells alcohol illegally in pharmacies across the country. Here, Fitzgerald rejects the traditional social mobility which the American dream claims. Gatsby is shown to be an intelligent, capable man, but even he resorted not to schooling and career building, instead taking up a life of illegitimate gains and criminality. Through this methodology, Gatsby does indeed amass a great fortune. It is a fortune which he displays ostentatiously for a number of reasons. In fact, his wealth often takes the place of Gatsby himself. Before we even meet him, the titular character is defined by the opulence of his home. The narrator Nick describes it. The house was a colossal affair by any standard. It was a factual imitation of some Hôtel de Ville in Normandy, with a tower on one side, spanking new under a thin beard of raw ivy, and a marble swimming pool and more than 40 acres of lawn and garden. Gatsby is further defined by the raucous parties which he throws each weekend, which are so blanketed in expense that they may as well be celebrations of money itself. Although glamorous, Fitzgerald unmasks these parties and again incisors the American dream. To execute his events, Gatsby employs a small army of butlers, maids, cooks, and servants. Every Friday, 5 crates of oranges and lemons arrived from a fruiterer in New York. Every Monday, these same oranges and lemons left his back door in a pyramid of pulpless halves. There was a machine in the kitchen which could extract the juice of 200 oranges in half an hour if a little button was pressed 200 times by a butler's thumb. The lower class, the butlers like this one, then, are little more than tools for Gatsby's glamorous lifestyle. Gatsby, who we take as the embodiment of the American dream, is built on the backs of the poor. His life requires exploitation. Like his machine extracts the juice from oranges only to discard the, quote, pulpless halves, Fitzgerald's American dream squeezes the layperson to extract the juice of capital for those invited to the party. Gatsby's absence continues through much of the book. So instead of meeting Gatsby, we are first introduced to his world, his parties, his house, his cars. Nick Carraway offers us this. There was music from my neighbor's house through the summer nights. In his blue gardens, men and girls came and went like moths among the whisperings and the champagne and the stars. At high tide in the afternoon, I watched his guests diving from the tower of his raft or taking the sun on the hot sand of his beach, while his 2 motorboats slit the waters of the Sound, drawing aquaplanes over cataracts of foam. On weekends, his Rolls-Royce became an omnibus, bearing parties to and from the city between 9 in the morning and long past midnight, while his station wagon scampered like a brisk yellow bug to meet all trains. And on Mondays, 8 servants, including an extra gardener, toiled all day with mops and scrubbing brushes and hammers and garden shears, repairing the ravages of the night before. These are the results of the American dream as Fitzgerald sees it. The sum of Fitzgerald's American dream is not in personal happiness, but in material abundance. These material things literally take the place of the man Gatsby himself. So to Fitzgerald, the American dream and its results become something of an illusion. Gatsby is and always has been happy to live in an illusion. The people who attend his parties do not know who he is. The aftermath of the parties is quickly disposed of each morning. Gatsby even proclaims that Daisy is a Catholic, and that is why she cannot divorce Tom. But Nick tells us outright that this isn't true. Daisy was not a Catholic, and I was a little shocked at the elaborateness of the lie. Gatsby even lived himself as an illusion. His wannabeisms, pink suits, and old sport verbiage bordered on the absurd to those like Nick Buchanan. Gatsby does not recognize the illusory nature of his life. He has convinced himself that the entirety of his life's efforts have been for Daisy. Indeed, it is his relationship with Daisy where we see Fitzgerald's impressions of the American dream and its pursuit displayed most viciously. When we are shown Gatsby and Daisy's very first introduction, prior to the events of the book itself, we can immediately see the true reasons for Gatsby's attraction. Gatsby was a soldier when he met Daisy, far removed from the debonair life he would go on to attain. He was stationed near her home, and the young Gatsby went with a group of fellow soldiers to visit the residence. Nick tells us, he went to her house, at first with other officers from Camp Taylor, then alone. It amazed him. He had never been in such a beautiful house before. But what gave it an air of breathless intensity was that Daisy lived there. It was as casual a thing to her as his tent out at camp was to him. Gatsby's takeaway from his first meeting with Daisy was not actually Daisy herself. Instead, it was her home. The house had a breathless intensity. The house was beautiful, not Daisy. On that same page, the prose goes on to wax further about the home. Again, the word beautiful only appears to describe the house, not Daisy herself. We are told too that Daisy has been loved by many men prior to Gatsby's first meeting. This only encouraged Gatsby. It excited him too that many men had already loved Daisy. It increased her value in his eyes. With the distinct choice of words, increased her value, we see Daisy referred to in market terms. She is classified more as an asset than a person, which is emblematic of Gatsby's material obsession. Here we also have a remarkable parallel with the American dream. It is one exalted by many, even proven by many famous individuals. Others have fulfilled it, so the masses are encouraged by these stories of success. So too with Daisy. The fact that other men had loved her only encouraged Gatsby's belief in his pursuit. Gatsby did ignite a romance upon first meeting Daisy, but the way it is communicated to the reader is remarkably unromantic. Fitzgerald writes, "He took what he could get, ravenously and unscrupulously. Eventually he took Daisy one still October night, took her because he had no real right to touch her hand." In his army uniform, Gatsby wore a disguise. He was unburdened by the cheap clothing which he would have otherwise worn. He could spin lies to Daisy about his past and his future, which he precisely did. When we see Daisy and Gatsby's relationship as a metaphor for the American dream, this truly becomes a vicious attack on that dream from Fitzgerald. Those who pursue the American dream do so ravenously and unscrupulously. They steal, lie, and deceive because this is the only way for Fitzgerald to make the American dream into reality. Gatsby has perhaps convinced himself to the contrary, that he has an earnest love for Daisy. But we can see very clearly that Gatsby's love was not for Daisy. It was for Daisy's world, for what she represented. So his love was false, was always false, in the same way Fitzgerald believes the American dream is also false. At the end of their tryst, Nick tells us Daisy, quote, vanished into her rich house, into her rich, full life, leaving Gatsby nothing. She left him no thing, rather than no body. And indeed, for Gatsby, Daisy was just that. A thing, an idea, not a person. And so, like Americans pursued their dream with every bit of faculty which existed in their lives, Gatsby does the same at Daisy. He spends years creating himself as the ideal match for her, as someone worthy of accomplishing her. When he finally reaches this pinnacle, when this height of the American dream is so occupied by money and material things, Fitzgerald begins to show us the illusion of it all. When Gatsby meets Daisy at the time of the story, we are once again shown the true nature of his infatuation. Fitzgerald writes, "It was Gatsby who was breathless, who was somehow betrayed. Her porch was bright with the bought luxury of starshine. The wicker of the settee squeaked fashionably as she turned towards him, and he kissed her curious and lovely mouth. She had caught a cold, and it made her voice huskier and more charming than ever, and Gatsby was overwhelmingly aware of the youth and mystery that wealth imprisons and preserves, of the freshness of many clothes, and of Daisy, gleaming like silver, safe and proud, above the hot struggles of the poor." Here Gatsby again recognizes not the beauty of Daisy as a person, but as a symbol. She gleamed like silver, safe and proud above the struggles of the poor. Struggles Gatsby knew intimately well. She is more territory than person, a promised land he can access if only he can win Daisy's affection. Earlier we discussed Gatsby's desire as the American dreamer to erase his past, to say no to his own background. He too imposes that on Daisy. Even after Daisy admits to loving Gatsby, that isn't enough. Gatsby tells her to tell Tom that she doesn't love him. This has been his lifelong vision. It never occurs to Gatsby to consider whether Daisy herself wants to participate in his dream. He assumes that she does, and that she will immediately erase the fact that she has been and is married to Tom and is the mother of Tom's child. Indeed, here is Fitzgerald's indictment on the American dream once again. According to our myth, the dreamer need not consider if the society of America wants to oblige his ambitions. The dreamer need only act, and he will achieve his ends, we are told. But Fitzgerald believes this to be false. He perceives that it is in large part up to the society if one is permitted to achieve their American dream. For her part, Daisy ultimately does not allow Gatsby in. The naive nature of the American dream is relayed once again in this exchange between Nick and Gatsby. "I wouldn't ask too much of her," I ventured. "You can't repeat the past." "Can't repeat the past?" he cried incredulously. "Why, of course you can." He looked around him wildly, as if the past were lurking here in the shadow of his house, just out of reach of his hand. "I'm going to fix everything just the way it was before," he said, nodding determinedly. "She'll see." Here we have Gatsby almost panicking in denial when he meets with the idea that his American dream may be out of reach. The very ethos of Gatsby cracks. He cries that he can repeat the past, though Gatsby's defining trait hitherto has been his outright rejection of his own past. At this point, it is starting to become clear to Gatsby that there is some piece of the puzzle which he does not have, which he may never have. He has bought into the American dream and is now discovering it may have been a propaganda. Fitzgerald notes Gatsby is looking around, searching for something in the shadows of his own house. The author then doubles down on this idea just lines later. "He talked a lot about the past, and I gathered he wanted to recover something, some idea of himself perhaps, that had gone into loving Daisy. His life has been confused and disordered since then, but if he could once return to a certain starting place and go over it all slowly, could find out what that thing was." That thing which was lurking in the shadows of his house, which he seeks to recover, is truth. The truth about his American dream. That it is, in fact, a lie. All through the book, the closer Gatsby gets to Daisy, the more unraveled his American dream becomes. When he moves into his mansion across from Daisy and Tom's, we are told about a mist hovering over the bay, which blocks Gatsby's view of the Buchanan home. He is right on the precipice, but suddenly unable to see his dream. Gatsby famously spends evenings staring at a green light which is perched on the end of Tom and Daisy's dock. This light is often at the center of Gatsby analysis, and for good reason. It is the entire book boiled down into one piece of machinery. Green is the color of life itself. It is too the color of money, greed, jealousy, and Wall Street. The light is the American dream, Gatsby's and Fitzgerald's all at once. And so we are presented with this damning passage. Daisy put her arm through his abruptly, but he seemed absorbed in what he had just said. Possibly it had occurred to him that the colossal significance of that light had now vanished forever. Compared to the great distance that had separated him from Daisy, it had seemed very near to her, almost touching her. It had seemed as close as a star to the moon. Now it was again a green light on a dock. His count of enchanted objects had diminished by 1. Again, the closer Gatsby comes to Daisy, the more fraudulent everything is revealed to be. This is brought to its ultimate not by Gatsby's own faculties, but by another character, Daisy's husband, Tom Buchanan. The destruction of Gatsby and his illusion occurs at Tom's hands. The main characters spend an afternoon in the Plaza Hotel in New York City. Tom calls Gatsby out on the entirety of his artifice, his false past, his bootlegging operation, his standing as an eternal outsider, saying that Gatsby should only see Daisy if he's bringing groceries to her door. Gatsby implores Daisy to tell Tom she never loved him, and she does so in the most non-committal way. She is trembling and immediately regretful. Daisy quickly backtracks and declares that she loved both men. In this scene, Tom commits many murders. He murders Gatsby's American dream, Gatsby's romance with Daisy, and the entirety of Gatsby's life's ambitions. Gatsby cannot be truly in elite society. He cannot be with Daisy. Despite all of his money, he will never gain access to his dream. The titular character realizes he will never be. He will always be almost. That missing piece which he searched for in his home, it is revealed to him by Tom. It is all of the truths and all of the lies. Tom also commits murder in the more real sense of the word. In short, Tom frames Gatsby for the death of his mistress Myrtle. Her widowed husband shoots Gatsby in his swimming pool, and Gatsby dies. The swimming pool is entirely emblematic of Fitzgerald's false American dream. It is opulent and beautiful and useless. The book tells us Gatsby never once swam in the pool, and so when he finally does, when he literally dives into his illusion, it becomes his grave. Jay Gatsby is just one cast member in Fitzgerald's American Nightmare, so to fully understand the book, we must investigate its other actors. Among interpretations and analysis of The Great Gatsby, it is popular to chastise Daisy Buchanan as a particularly venomous character. The following phrases have all been used to describe Daisy: vicious emptiness, monstrous moral indifference, criminally amoral, vulgar and inhuman, dark destroyer, a purveyor of corruption and death, and one even more verbose. An early critic called Daisy the, quote, first notable anti-virgin of our fiction, the prototype of the blasphemous portraits of the fair goddess as bitch in which our 20th century fiction abounds. Clearly, Daisy is not looked upon favorably, nor should she be. None of the characters in The Great Gatsby can really be described as good people. But Fitzgerald was a masterful author, and so his characters should not be reduced to clumsy categorizations of bad or good, Daisy very much included. For critics, Daisy Buchanan was a punching bag, and for the characters in The Great Gatsby, she serves much the same purpose. One of Daisy's first lines in the novella is a sort of confession. She meets Nick and proclaims, "I'm paralyzed with happiness." Daisy is too a victim of the American dream. Her paralysis is the chief symptom. Daisy's paralysis is large. By marrying Tom, her life has become frozen by money and status. She comes from money and married into money. Her whole life has been dictated by convention and circumstance. Daisy is the embodiment of the vulgar materialism which Fitzgerald saw in the American dream. She was an insider, desperately and ruthlessly clinging to her status and her riches. Fitzgerald did not seek empathy for the Daisies of the world, these ruling class sorts. And so Daisy is not portrayed as a particularly likable woman. She is lazy, flighty, and unconcerned with anything outside of her immediate strata. But this was not really the fault of Daisy. Rather, it was the impact of American materialism, a sort of brainwashing. See, Daisy is something of a two-sided card. On one side, she is presented as shallow and vaguely self-obsessed. But this is how her world instructed her to be, and Daisy is well aware of this. So on the reverse side, we have an intelligent, perhaps even cunning woman who is just as attached to her status as Gatsby himself also is. When describing her infant daughter, Daisy says, I hope she'll be a fool. That's the best thing a girl can be in this world. A beautiful little fool. This line alone speaks volumes for her character. She is well aware of her insider status and how one achieves it as a woman. So with this in mind, while she does love Gatsby in her own, perhaps shallow way, Daisy ultimately prioritizes her status over this love. Daisy flirts with the idea of running away with Gatsby, certainly. We are told of an incident that occurred before the events of the book. When Daisy received a letter from Gatsby on the eve of her wedding, she ripped a $350,000 pearl necklace from her neck, leaving the pearls to scatter onto the ground. This necklace was a gift she'd received from Tom.
Crazy shit.
Daisy called the wedding off, but was immediately forced by her friends and staff into an ice-cold bath. As she was forced into the bath, Daisy was still clutching Gatsby's letter. The water destroyed the letter, and the wedding went on as planned. This bath, too, can be seen as Fitzgerald's American dream. It is a cold shock, ultimately bringing the illusions of materialism into a paralyzing truth for all parties involved. Nick tells us, all the time Gatsby was overseas, something within her was crying for a decision. She wanted her life shaped now, immediately, and the decision must be made by some force of love, of money, of unquestionable practicality that was close at hand. And so she married Tom Buchanan, who was unfaithful, abusive, and brutish. Daisy is not purely a victim, though. She is just as deplorable as her peers, and Fitzgerald makes that quite clear throughout the story. After all, for whatever self-awareness she displays on the dangers of her lifestyle, she elects repeatedly to remain in her castle. She shows no interest in the needs or wants of others, with the possible exception of Gatsby. But upon inspection, even her feelings towards Gatsby seem fraudulent. Indeed, the two have that distinctly in common. Daisy is basically Gatsby. Jay Gatsby has constructed and lives in a fantasy land. Daisy herself expresses this same desire. She tells Gatsby, I'd like to just get one of those pink clouds and put you in it and push you around. She has a romantic vision of her life with Gatsby, an escape from the insistences of material society, a dreamlike land where reality need not exist. She seeks the past. She desires to relive the early stages of her romance with Gatsby prior to her marriage and prior to her insertion into the world of Tom Buchanan. Gatsby sees cracks in his vision for Daisy. Likewise, but more severely, Daisy finds Gatsby unable to meet her expectations. Gatsby demands that she tells Tom she does not love him. He demands Daisy fit perfectly into his vision for life, which in turn does not fit into her vision. This is made abundant as Gatsby ostentatiously shows off his collection of fine shirts. When Gatsby shows the shirts to Daisy, they are piled neatly in his closet, but he begins to throw them onto the floor in a messy pile. Daisy's reaction is to weep. The ideal of her and Gatsby, her dreamland, also comes apart like the neat piles of shirts. She realizes that Gatsby's world is an illusion, as is her vision for their romance, and so her desire can never be fulfilled. When Tom reveals Gatsby's true nature to Daisy in the hotel, she finally withdraws from Gatsby entirely. Fitzgerald writes, with every word she was drawing further and further into herself, so he gave that up, and only the dead dream fought on as the afternoon slipped away, trying to touch what was no longer tangible, struggling unhappily, undespairingly, toward that lost voice across the room. Daisy's fantasy is truly dead. Gatsby could not live up to her vision for him. Within Gatsby and Daisy we have a mutual disillusionment, but the results of each are wildly divergent. Fitzgerald realizes that Daisy, being of the privileged elite, has a safety net. She can return to her life with Tom. Driving Gatsby's car with him in the passenger seat, Daisy hits and kills Tom's mistress. There's nothing to indicate that this was intentional, but it allows Daisy to slip back into her previous life with Tom Buchanan uninterrupted. She is damningly happy to let Gatsby carry the blame, legal or otherwise, for the incident. Tellingly, Daisy and Gatsby both have their hands on the wheel when they kill the woman. Indeed, they both steered their own fantasies into death. With no great stretch of the imagination, we can read The Great Gatsby as a letter of hatred to the elites of American society and all they represent. In such a case, it would be Tom Buchanan's name on the envelope. In a swarm of bad, Tom Buchanan is perhaps the worst. Tom is brutish. He is a well-built man who, in appearance and in beliefs, becomes a sort of proto-fascist. He spews racist vitriol, detests the lower class, and is perfectly happy to leave destruction in his wake. Tom's physical description is relevant to this theme of the American dream. He is described as having a cruel body which is capable of enormous leverage. At one point, he hits his impoverished mistress Myrtle and breaks her nose. Tom Buchanan is not only Tom. He is the generations of wealthy American families who conquered the lower classes, who are capable of a strange and leisurely sort of oppression. Like Tom, these people would rather spend afternoons drinking and playing polo, but with the slightest whim, the Toms of the world can uproot and destroy those who are beneath them. Indeed, Tom does just this. It only takes a brief monologue for him to undo the lifelong work of J. Gatsby. Tom and Daisy have many of their worst qualities in common. While their relationship cannot be categorized as happy or even entirely functional, the pair are intimately similar. Near the end of the book, Nick concludes, "They were careless people, Tom and Daisy. They smashed up things and creatures and then retreated back into their money or their vast carelessness or whatever it was that kept them together and let other people clean up the mess they had made." Indeed, this sort of well-financed carelessness is a tie which bonds Daisy and Tom together. It is a unique trait which Fitzgerald notes exists preeminently in those who hold status like the Buchanan. Tom Buchanan is enormously wealthy despite having no career and contributing nothing to society. Tom further has no ambition other than to keep invaders like Gatsby out of his castle. Daisy likewise, she is never portrayed as having any particular motivation besides self-interest. She is not as direct in her oppression as Tom, but she has a guilt by complacence. Her romance with Gatsby results in the deaths of 2 individuals. Nothing indicates that either of these bodies weigh on her conscience at all. She does not attend Gatsby's funeral. This makes for a very clear portrait of how Fitzgerald sees old money elites. At the end of the story, Tom and Daisy perform one of the classically imperial American feats. After engineering chaos and destruction, they simply leave. They just move on, unbound by consequence. Tom's mistress, Myrtle, is a supporting character in this story, but in reading The Great Gatsby within the context of the American Dream, she is remarkably significant. Myrtle not only propels much of the action in the novella, she provides grand insight into the story's main characters. Like Gatsby, Myrtle has her own American dream. Hers is wealth and all of the lifestyle which comes with it. Myrtle is married to a man named George, who is a mechanic and owns a gas station. By her actions and words, it is clear that Myrtle despises her husband. He is a poor man who was forced to borrow his suit for their wedding. Remarking upon this, Myrtle says, "The only crazy I was when I married him. I knew right away I made a mistake. He borrowed somebody's suit to get married in and never told me about it, and the man came after it one day when he was out." We do not learn much about George as a person, but it is almost irrelevant. Myrtle disdains George's status, and so she disdains him. In her American dream, Myrtle enters into an affair with Tom Buchanan. She believes that this is a way to enter into the aristocratic society. Myrtle is under the impression that Tom will leave Daisy for her, although there is little to indicate this was ever Tom's intention. As typical for Fitzgerald in the novella, Myrtle's quest for her American dream decays and eventually kills her. Tom is Myrtle's dream. He abuses her, lies to her, and manipulates her. In the end, her relationship with Tom brings about her death. She is killed by Daisy, who is at the wheel of Gatsby's car. Of course, Tom Buchanan simply continues with his days. Nick Carraway is the narrator of the novella. Much has been debated about his reliability as a narrator, but I believe that Nick is and must be reasonably reliable for the book to even function. Fitzgerald exchanged a series of letters with his editor after finishing The Great Gatsby, in which they discuss Nick Carraway as a narrator. In these letters, Fitzgerald does not say anything to indicate that Nick is unreliable. Furthermore, The Great Gatsby is about the corruption and decline of the American dream. This is not a labyrinthian interpretation or abstract idea. It is the central theme of the book as expressed by Fitzgerald himself. It is through Nick Carraway that Fitzgerald communicates his notion of this dream. This notion is the whole point of the book, so for The Great Gatsby to even function, Nick must be reliable. If Nick is untrustworthy, then the novella becomes little more than a soap opera. Nick is not an unreliable narrator in the traditional sense of the word, but he is also not a truly objective narrator. While it is tempting to categorize him in either camp, Nick is what I would call a biased narrator. Nick has a background which is relevant to the story and how we receive the story. He is a person of means. Nick graduated from Yale, but he does not have the same laziness-inducing status of the Buchanans. He fought in the war. Nick made the decision to travel east to pursue the bond business, though he seems to have rather mixed feelings about it. He recounts having dinner at the Yale Yacht Club, but notes it was an experience he did not enjoy. Nick is something of an outsider in the story. At least he is outside of the materialism and the American dreaming which propels virtually all of the other characters. Fitzgerald establishes this early in the novella when Nick states, "I lived at West Egg, the less fashionable of the two." So this is a most superficial tag to express the bizarre and not a little sinister contrast between them. Nick is put off by the division of East and West Egg, describing this attitude as bizarre and sinister. Throughout the story, he is in awe of the materialism around him. He remarks on the opulence of Gatsby, Daisy, and Tom. Nick ultimately leaves the East Coast, describing the area as having a quality of distortion, and laments his journey as him visiting the wrong house. The Buchanans, especially Tom, are quick to judge and excommunicate those of the lower classes. Nick is generally welcomed around them throughout the whole story, but regards the group with an amount of distaste. It is clear that Nick has no particular love for the lifestyles of the other characters. Nick notes that he is from a family of, quote, prominent, well-to-do people in this Middle Western city for 3 generations. So clearly someone in Nick's family did accomplish the American dream, perhaps Fitzgerald's more pure, authentic version of it, which produced a reasonable individual like Nick. One can make the case that Nick is a bad person. He did, after all, stand by and witness the world-burning and lethal drama of his peers unfold, but I think it is more accurate to call Nick shallow. He is a shallow person who wants shallow relationships. We can see this when he writes, I like to walk up Fifth Avenue and pick out romantic women from the crowd, and imagine that in a few minutes I was going to enter into their lives, and no one would ever know or disapprove. Sometimes in my mind I followed them to their apartments on the corners of hidden streets, and they turned and smiled back at me before they faded through a door into warm darkness. Even Nick's most romantic, intimate fantasies conclude in anonymity. Nick also declares that, quote, life is best viewed through a single window. He has no interest in grand perspectives. His view of the world is intentionally limited. Nick does not intervene or save anyone simply because he is not interested. Perhaps that makes him a bad person, or perhaps not. That is for the reader to decide. But Nick speaks to his inaction in the book. He has a very cynical opinion on the prospect of saving these people from anything. Nick states that the entire group was distorted beyond his eyes' power of correction. To Nick, the American dream is sour. He views the things which characterize it as corrupt and bizarre. So he functions as something of a proxy for Fitzgerald himself, embodying a sense of disillusionment. Nick ultimately washes his hands of the entire Gatsby affair, concluding that all is, in fact, lost. We can perhaps see this in the following passage. I was reminded of something, an elusive rhythm, a fragment of lost words that I heard somewhere a long time ago. For a moment, a phrase tried to take shape in my mouth, and my lips parted like a dumb man's, as though there was more struggling upon them than a wisp of startled air. But they made no sound, and what I had almost remembered was incommunicado forever. There is one minor character who is emblematic of Fitzgerald's American dream. That is Ewing Klipspringer, who is a piano player and something of a squatter at Gatsby's residence. Indeed, he gets the nickname The Boarder. Although Klipspringer has relatively little space in the book, his existence is a pointed warning of American materialism. Klipspringer often plays piano at Gatsby's parties, serving as an entertainer, but he lingers around the home throughout the week, and even still, Gatsby seems to have only disinterested ambivalence for the man. Klipspringer is almost a caricature of the American materialist. He wanders around Gatsby's home, unkempt, taking advantage of his host's blasé generosity. Klipspringer is a wholly disrespectful and disinterested man who enjoys only the rampant debauchery and material possessions which Gatsby provides. He attends Gatsby's funeral not out of respect, but instead to request a pair of shoes be sent to his house. For Fitzgerald, this is the impact that the American dream and surrounding culture has on the individual. It transmutes people into leeches who care not for one another, but instead suck away at their peers for the material luxuries of life. In Fitzgerald's eyes, the American experience can be separated into 2 distinct parts. There exist the material, physical, functional realities of our American life. On the other hand, there are the more profound and universal, the spiritual wants and needs of the human. Within Fitzgerald's American dream, it is incredibly difficult to see where one of these ends and the other begins. Does the American dream, insofar as it is represented by the Gatsbys and Buchanans, fulfill our spiritual needs? Does it take the place of them? Perhaps Gatsby represents the spiritual, the idea that things can always infinitely become better. This is a sort of blind faith which requires some degree of youthful optimism, but can produce incredible results. Meanwhile, the Buchanans are the material realities. The idea that becoming better has suddenly become synonymous with accumulating money, as well as the functional hierarchies that have simultaneously made this both true and absurd. Unfortunately, Gatsby is never able to see through his illusion. It is Gatsby for whom the lines have become impossibly blurred. He is unable to discern that he is great in a way which the Buchanans will never be, and so he becomes terrible in the way the Buchanans are. The realities of American society meant Gatsby could never fulfill his dream. He is the spiritual which is confused with the material. The Great Gatsby takes place in a fictional version of Long Island, New York. In the book, this residential area is divided into West Egg and East Egg. West Egg is considered the new money side. It is where Gatsby lives. The houses in West Egg are often aspirationally modeled after famous mansions in Europe. The East Egg is a more desirable, fashionable part of town that is inhabited mostly by old money types, and of course it is where the Buchanans live. It is plainly obvious to see how these 2 places fit into Fitzgerald's vision of the American dream. These 2 neighborhoods seem to represent the division between the American dream and its more real counterpart. There are the dreamers and there are those who already sit at the top, and these 2 groups are linked by their love of material goods. This allegory is made even more clear when we investigate what lies between East and West Egg. The Valley of the Ashes is a bleak industrial wasteland between the two eggs. Unlike the egg neighborhoods, the valley is inhabited by the very poor. The valley is also occupied by factories and smokestacks, which put a gray, dusty bleakness over the area and its residents. While the eggs are described in high, shimmering language, Fitzgerald paints a much bleaker picture of the Valley of Ashes. He uses phrases like ash gray, paintless days, spasms of bleak dust, and calls it a solemn dumping ground. Even the name itself invokes feelings of death. Within the book, the Valley of the Ashes is the only setting which is described as anything besides aesthetically magnificent. For Fitzgerald, the American dream, insofar as it existed, was built on the backs of the poor. The Valley of the Ashes represents this idea wholly. It is a place in which production happens. On a very real level, it is full of factories. The novel's two poorest characters, Myrtle and her husband, also live in the Valley of the Ashes. The valley is where the opulence of the Buchanans and the Gatsbys is truly produced, but it is also the place which suffers the most visibly from this production. So here we have a vaguely apocalyptic worldview from Fitzgerald. The Valley of the Ashes is sort of the dirty secret, the hidden ingredient of our American dream. It is perhaps too the result produced by a society of materialism. While the valley features the story's most dismal atmosphere, it is also the place where the book's most tragic events occur. It is where Tom is unfaithful to Daisy. It is too where Tom physically abuses his mistress Myrtle. Daisy kills Myrtle in the Valley of Ashes. This event also sets into motion the death of Gatsby himself. Tom and Daisy ruthlessly abuse and exploit the people in the Valley of Ashes. So too we have the American dream and its materialism, sucking the life from the lower classes. In the Valley of the Ashes, there is an old weathered billboard for an optometrist named Dr. T.J. Eckelberg. The billboard features a large pair of blue eyes rimmed by golden spectacles. This advertisement is often a well-deserved centerpiece in analysis of The Great Gatsby. It is generally accepted that these eyes represent God himself. This idea comes from two places. First, Scott Fitzgerald was a religious man, despite his often indulgent lifestyle. Secondly, one of the book's characters explicitly states this meaning. When Mr. Wilson confronts Myrtle about her affair, he takes her to their window and they gaze at the billboard. Mr. Wilson declares, "God knows what you've been doing, everything you've been doing. You may fool me, but you can't fool God." The book's most tragic events occur under the watchful eyes of Dr. Ethelberg. In this way, we can perceive Fitzgerald appealing to the highest order. Even if we the people fail ourselves and our country, we cannot go without punishment. God is always watching. The Great Gatsby is one of the finest American works ever produced, but by many people's opinions, it is the only time F. Scott Fitzgerald soared to such enormous heights. So to earnestly understand the work, we should understand Fitzgerald himself. F. Scott Fitzgerald spent most of his life writing about the rich, but in his childhood, he was decidedly middle class. His father was a twice-failed businessman, and only through an inheritance on Fitzgerald's mother's side was the family able to live in middle-class comfort. An aunt of Scott Fitzgerald paid for him to attend a private school where his results were mediocre. The author eventually did attend Princeton, but only to drop out and join the military during World War I. Without getting too far into the particulars of Fitzgerald's youth, we can say he was distinctly not part of the Gatsby's or Buchanan's world, but some part of him likely yearned for just that. In 1918, the penniless Fitzgerald wrote to his friend, "I know I'll wake up some morning and find the debutantes have made me famous overnight." This happened precisely when he published the book This Side of Paradise in 1920. The book was a smash success, and suddenly Fitzgerald's status changed markedly. He later wrote that the offices of New York were suddenly open to him. Quote, "I, who knew less of New York than any reporter of 6 months' standing, was pushed into the position of spokesman for the Time." And indeed, Fitzgerald basked in this new lifestyle. He was a full-on literary celebrity, gallivanting around New York bars and high society. He later wrote that he once wept because, quote, "I had everything I wanted and knew I would never be so happy again." This is all to say the issues of class mobility and even the American dream were ones Fitzgerald knew intimately well. He did seem to grow disillusioned with the glitz and glam, however. Fitzgerald called that period of America the greatest, gaudiest spending period in history. He would later write that even the snow wasn't real, that if you didn't want it to snow, you could just pay some money. But this lifestyle eventually caught up with Fitzgerald. In the early 20s, F. Scott was about $5,000 in debt, around $39,000 in today's money. He began working 12 hours per day, writing 11 short stories in 5 months to climb out of debt. By Fitzgerald's words, this sum allowed him to rise from abject poverty back into the middle class. This work was far from fulfilling, though. He wrote to a friend that the writing was all trash and it nearly broke my heart. So by the time Fitzgerald wrote The Great Gatsby, he had ascended to the pinnacle of society, crashed, and then begun to pick himself up again. With The Great Gatsby, though, Fitzgerald abandoned lofty ideas about romantic high society. Instead, he returned to what he knew. The titular character, James Gatz, was an impoverished Midwesterner. Gatsby's ability to move through the classes was partially based on Fitzgerald himself, with the author noting, "He started out as one man I knew, and then changed into myself." The character of Daisy, a Southern belle, was largely inspired by Fitzgerald's lover Zelda, who, like Daisy, was an aloof, wealthy, Alabama-born woman who changed romantic decisions at the drop of a hat. Nick Carraway's past mirrors much of Fitzgerald's. Tom Buchanan is even imbued with some of the author. In his schooling days, just like Tom, Fitzgerald was a prodigiously talented athlete. All of Fitzgerald's experiences in American society equipped him with a sharp, harsh perspective on our country's culture. Fitzgerald's thesis with The Great Gatsby was something like this: the culture of American materialism has corrupted American ideals and will continue to fracture the country. Indeed, he was proven correct, almost immediately. In 1928, President Hoover proclaimed, "We in America today are nearer to the financial triumph over poverty than ever before in the history of our land. The poor man is vanishing from us. Under the Republican system, our industrial output has increased as never before, and our wages have grown steadily in buying power." In a way, Hoover was right. The poor were vanishing. They were vanishing from their jobs because of an increasingly unstable farming industry. They were vanishing from unions due to a concerted effort to minimize the power of the worker. African-American sharecroppers were vanishing from the South due to mass layoffs, forced to take low-paying jobs in segregated neighborhoods and live in squalor. Mexican Americans were vanishing too. They lived in extreme poverty with an infant mortality rate 5 times higher than their white counterparts. Despite Hoover's declarations, income inequality was on the rise like never before. By 1929, the top 1% of the population owned 19% of all personal wealth. The top 5% owned 34%. Certainly today, these numbers seem tame by comparison. But in 1929, a family of 4 required $2,000 per year for basic necessities. 50% of American families in that same year did not reach this minimum threshold. Then in 1929, the stock market crashed. Farms, factories, and mines collapsed, decimating the lower classes first. The automobile industry cratered. This all rippled through the upper crust, wiping out investments and savings. Foreign trade stumbled by 66%, and within 3 years, personal income in America had dropped off by 50%. The American dream, Fitzgerald's or otherwise, was by all counts dead. In 1931, Fitzgerald wrote an essay called Echoes of the Jazz Age, in which he practically eulogizes for the high-flying dreamers of the 20s. It ended 2 years ago because the utter confidence, which was its essential prop, received an enormous jolt, and it didn't take long for the flimsy structure to settle earthward. And after 2 years, the Jazz Age seems as far away as the days before the war. It was borrowed time anyhow. The whole upper tenth of a nation living with the indifference of grand dukes and the casualness of chorus girls. But the moralizing is easy now, and it was pleasant to be in one's 20s in such a certain and unworried time. The American dream would be reborn in the ashes of World War II, however. The American economy grew by 37% in the 1950s, and the American family saw a 30% surge in spending power. Surely it is no coincidence that it was the 50s when The Great Gatsby was finally lauded as a masterpiece of American literature. In the years since, the American dream has died and been reborn over and over again. I tend to think this essay need not leap into every incarnation and failure. Instead, for our conclusion, we can simply look to the man who invented the American dream itself. Fitzgerald saw the potential for the American dream to decay, but he was not the first one to envision this possibility. In fact, this dream was brought into phrase alongside exactly this type of warning. James Truslow Adams coined the term, the American dream, in his 1931 book, The Epic of America. He notes pointedly the materialistic perils of our American dream, saying, "The American dream that has lured tens of millions of all nations to our shores in the past century has not been a dream of merely material plenty, though that has doubtless counted heavily. It has been much more than that. It has been a dream of being able to grow to fullest development as man and woman, unhampered by the barriers which had slowly been erected in older civilizations, unrepressed by social orders which had developed for the benefit of classes, rather than for the simple human being of any and every class. And that dream has been realized more fully in actual life here than anywhere else, though very imperfectly, even among ourselves. Our American dream should not be predicated on larger houses or faster cars. We should not be Gatsby, and we should not aspire to be the Buchanans. We must create a fuller dream than these shimmering objects. We must seek one which elevates and works for all, not alone the privileged. Our American dream must not be a guarded tower in the East Egg, but a place which grants entry to those citizens of the world who seek earnest fulfillment. Mechanically, this requires more than the free hand of our markets. It requires caution, thought, and indeed action. As Adams noted, if the American dream is to come true and to abide with us, it will, at bottom, depend on the people themselves. If we are to achieve a richer and fuller life for all, they have got to know what such an achievement implies. In a modern industrial state, an economic base is essential for all. We point to pride to our national income, but the nation is only an aggregate of individual men and women. And when we turn from the single figure of total income to the incomes of individuals, we find a very marked injustice in its distribution. It has been said that those qualities you dislike in others are the ones you see in yourself. As we look at Fitzgerald's book and its actors, The Great Gatsby proves this can also be true for an entire nation. The Great Gatsby eviscerated the very soul of America, and 1 century later, it continues to do so.
That's it. End of story. Yep. Okay.
Before we get started, if you're interested in the medieval era, you'd probably
Okay. Boom.
definitely not. I engage as much as anyone, probably more. So when I say we, I do mean we. So how did we get here? Why can't we experience a moment of silence without being overwhelmed by anxiety? Why do we always need to be watching or listening to something? What happened? The whole dopamine hit thing is the quickest explanation, and one that you may be thinking of right now. Before I started making this video, I assumed it to be true, but turns out, while still relevant, the idea of a quick dopamine fix is kind of a myth, and we'll get into that and a whole lot more. See, the truth has to do with a misunderstanding about dopamine, decreasing attention spans, and a huge failed promise. If things are difficult now, where are we going with all of this? Can new forms of stimulation just keep appearing forever to compete for our attention? There are a lot of pieces to put together, but that's exactly what we're going to do. Common knowledge dictates that we want constant stimulation because we're seeking quick hits of dopamine. We're all addicted to this so-called pleasure chemical, and every time we find a funny video or an arousing image, we get our fix. Then we go back for more and more and more and more until infinity. This idea ties dopamine and self-improvement up in a nice little clickable package. Influencers and whoever can tell you that the key to improving happiness is by resetting your dopamine. That's simple, that's easy, but it's not totally true. Truth is more complicated. Dopamine is not released as a pleasure chemical. Dopamine is fired off before the pleasure is experienced as an anticipation chemical. The reward is not really relevant to dopamine release. Evolutionarily, this is intended to help with a try-again mentality. If you're hunting and you miss your quarry, dopamine ensures that the attempt itself encourages you to try again. Scientifically, near misses actually produce even more dopamine than getting your desired result. Say you got $5 every time you pressed a button. Anticipation of each $5 reward would release dopamine. But then imagine if the button started giving you $100 for each press. You'd get even more dopamine for a little while before eventually declining back down to the $5 dopamine level, despite still getting $100 on each press. At that point, if the button switched back to $5 bills, your dopamine levels would decline even further to a place below that original $5 level. If dopamine was a pleasure chemical, you would get X amount of dopamine for the $5, then more for the $100, then right back down to X for the $5. But that's not what happens. The $5 button loses its ability to create dopamine as it becomes your new baseline. This shows that dopamine is not tied to the intrinsic value of the reward, but the difference between your reward and your default state. $5 is only nice, basically until you have $5. So think about taking a walk. A walk provides a reward compared to our baseline of staying inside. It used to, anyways. Just walking outside in nature, alone in silence, was great for a while. Then we were offered a podcast we could listen to while we took our walk. That's even better. So we did that until that got boring. But then we could scroll through TikTok while we listen to a podcast while we take a walk. That's amazing. But now taking a walk, maybe our $5 button, is shockingly boring. Unfortunately, this has no end. The human brain is not wired to find satisfaction. Because of our dopamine systems, as we consume more, we actually desire more. It's perhaps one of our most fatal flaws. So eventually we have to be constantly stimulated because we've had our $5 and then our $100 and then our $1,000. And now that $5, whether it's taking a walk, sitting in a park, cooking breakfast, or whatever, it's just not enough. So how do we fix it? Well, that's complicated. Because to fix the problem, we need a full picture of the diagnosis. And Dopamine alone is helpful, but does not give us this full picture.
What's wrong with the picture here?
Our attention spans are getting demonstrably shorter. Anecdotally, I think we could all probably agree with this. But there have been numerous studies that prove this phenomenon more scientifically. Indeed, our attention spans have gotten shorter as the amount of information in the world has grown. We only have so much real estate available in our minds. Now there are endless acres of information to consume. The problem is that instead of just ignoring some stuff, we are convinced by ourselves, our peers, or culture at large to just fit everything into our brains. We are told by any number of these sources that we have to care about every single news item and current event. This is our modern obligation. This is FOMO, the fear of missing out. If we aren't up to date on everything, we are cruel or soulless or ignorant or all of the above. But at the same time, we still have our actual personal interests. There's endless information at our fingertips about things we genuinely do love. And why bother living if we can't pursue the things we enjoy? So we slowly decided to just make room for everything. In this amount of time, the real estate of our mind cannot and has not grown. Instead, it's just been divided into smaller and smaller pieces with every passing day. When we pair this concept with the idea that the more we consume, the hungrier we get, it becomes really easy to understand why we all need constant stimulation. But still, there remains one last piece of the puzzle.
Fact is, we can't climb that.
It was thought that technology would lighten our collective load. Robots, systems, computers, they were going to take some of the baggage off of our hands. But in reality, these things have taken our baggage only to replace it with, well, other baggage. Technology has relieved us from a physical workload, but replaced it with a spiritual exhaustion. It has taken physical distance and replaced that with a new kind of division. Armed with all of the information in the universe, we were supposed to be absolved of ignorance. Instead, there is ignorance like never before. We are forced to grapple with the effects of a failed promise brought onto us by a technocratic government, a capitalist system, and indeed, our own selves. I can't sit here on YouTube and seriously advocate for the downfall of modern technology, but I just wonder, when we get to a point where technology does more harm than good, how will we know? I don't have an answer to that question. Deep societal changes can happen slowly over time in a large-scale way. That's how we got here. We can recognize issues, vote based on these issues, and solve our problems together. But today, as an individual, right now, you cannot change the system you are facing. But you do have power. You have agency, because you can change how you function within that system. If you're looking for a solid, well-defined way to overcome these obstacles that I've spoken about, I'm sorry. This video cannot provide that. In fact, I don't think any video can provide that. We're all so different. We have so many different brain chemistries, lived experiences, cultural influences, and circumstances that there's no blanket remedy for basically any problem, this one very much included. Meditation works for a lot of people, but maybe not everyone. Abstaining from digital life, the same, could be good, but could be entirely unrealistic for any given person. The list of would-be remedies just goes on like that. So all I can do is provide my perspective, and maybe it will offer some value. But I do this bearing in mind that I have not yet won this battle.
Oh, we are fucked.
Fleeting moments of pleasure aren't real happiness. So it could be helpful to examine and maybe redefine what makes us profoundly and permanently happy. A person could seek those things and perhaps find joy in just the journey of discovering or accomplishing them. Consuming media is super easy, and change is really difficult. Changing this stuff specifically in this world is monumentally difficult. Again, I'm not even close to having done it. I ultimately think that during this type of change, every day will be a struggle. And you will fail, but every single day, you can get up and try again.
Oh, these videos are short.
We interpret the choices they make. Because beyond the modern caricature, there is a more profound and rarely told story of Ernest Hemingway. A tragic story about a man predestined to destroy himself. Through a number of factors well outside of his control, Hemingway was doomed from the start. But by approaching the life and times of Ernest Hemingway with empathy and compassion, we can unravel the truth about one of history's most impactful creatives.
Cool.
The New York Times called Ernest Hemingway the most significant author since Shakespeare. Born in the American Midwest, Hemingway led a truly outrageous life. He was in both world wars and had a lifelong fascination with bullfighting. He became a deep-sea fisherman in the Caribbean. The man survived 2 plane crashes and hunted big game in Africa. Hemingway had 4 marriages. While it wasn't always pretty, there can be no doubt. Ernest Hemingway lived life on the edge.
Brutal.
He channeled these experiences into his work. Hemingway showed a huge talent for writing from a young age. Throughout his life, his novels and short stories reached astonishing heights of critical and commercial success. He was a superstar. At the end of all of this, Hemingway ended his own life with a shotgun. We can never truly understand why a person commits suicide, but by examining each part of his life and his world, we can understand the circumstances that forged Ernest Hemingway. In the memoir A Movable Feast, Hemingway wrote, "Families have many ways of being dangerous." Indeed, Hemingway's family was just that, dangerous. Ernest Hemingway was born to Dr. Clarence and Grace Hemingway. He was one of 6 children. As soon as you examine his parents and then his siblings, very disturbing patterns begin to emerge. Dr. Clarence Hemingway was a strict Christian conservative and a vicious disciplinarian who likely suffered from undiagnosed bipolar disorder. He would spank and beat his son with a leather strap. Clarence suffered from abrupt, serious mood swings. These depressive episodes required him to spend large amounts of time in isolation, living far away from the Hemingways' Illinois home. Throughout Hemingway's life, his father expressed disdain for almost everything that the author produced. In one instance, he called a short story of Ernest's filth that should not have been published anywhere. Ernest's opinion of his father seemed to swing wildly throughout his life. There were times in childhood and adulthood when he admired Clarence Hemingway. But notably, as a child, Ernest had a ritual. Ernest would hide in his family's shed with a shotgun. He would line his father's head up in the sights of the loaded firearm as if a sort of mock assassination of his own father. Throughout his life, Dr. Clarence had a recurring crippling battle with depression. In his 50s, he lost that battle once and for all. Dr. Clarence took his own life, shooting himself in the head with a pistol. This is perhaps the moment that divides Ernest's life into a BC and AD. When his father died, Ernest remarked that it was as if his own life had been shot out from under him. After this incident, his alcoholism and destructive personality traits snowballed like never before. Indeed, he began to express sympathy for his father's decision, but we will discuss that more later. Ernest hated his mother, Grace Hemingway, not in the way that a spoiled teenager hates their mom, but in a deep, unrelenting, and permanent way. As a boy, Grace insisted that Ernest be dressed like a girl. She had his hair cut short like a girl's. On the back of a photograph of young Ernest wearing a lace dress, Grace wrote the words, "Summer Girl." Grace even attempted to pass her son off as the twin of his older sister, Marceline. She was obsessed with this idea. Grace had Marceline held back a year in school so that the siblings would be in the same grade. But at the same time, she would praise Ernest for displaying masculine behavior. She complimented his skill at hunting and fishing and lauded him for his love of manly outdoor activities. Ernest's rage toward his mother began at a young age. Grace would often refer to Ernest as, quote, Dutch Dolly, while the boy called his mother Tweety. At the age of 2, Grace once called Ernest Dutch Dolly, and he responded with, "I not Dutch Dolly. Bang bang. I shoot Tweety." So in his childhood, Ernest expressed a desire to shoot both of his parents. When his father committed suicide, Ernest blamed his mother entirely. In numerous communications, journals, and letters, Ernest would later refer to his mother as that bitch and said that her controlling, domineering personality drove his father to kill himself. This hatred never eased. Looking at other members of the Hemingway family, it's easy to see a pattern of intense psychiatric disability. His mother, Grace, suffered from anxiety and insomnia. 2 of Ernest's uncles struggled with similar issues. 2 of Ernest's 5 siblings committed suicide. A third died in 1963, officially due to natural causes, but the family strongly suspected suicide. So of the 6 Hemingway children, 4 of them committed suicide. It is likely that Ernest and his own father both suffered from bipolar disorder. Ernest Hemingway's youngest son, Gregory, was diagnosed with this same condition during his life. Although a practicing doctor, Gregory lost his medical license after having uncontrollable substance abuse issues. Throughout his life, Gregory's struggles led to multiple psychiatric hospitalizations and arrests. He eventually died of natural causes in a Miami jail. Ernest's granddaughter suffered from bulimia, depression, and a seizure disorder before eventually killing herself. That was 6 suicides in 4 generations of the Hemingway family. Hemingway was born with a generational talent for writing, but he was also born with a litany of incurable and eventually fatal mental disorders. Throughout his life, Ernest self-reported depressive episodes over and over again. In one letter, he told a friend, "I felt that gigantic bloody emptiness and nothingness. Like I couldn't ever fuck, fight, write, it was all for death." This is just one example, but he would go on to report profound instances of depression throughout his life. Hemingway's first major biographer categorized him as a temperamental manic depressive and said that he swung wildly forever between megalomania and melancholy. This biographer wrote that his mood swung so quickly that he may as well have been exhilarated and depressed at the same time. This radical swinging would manifest itself in his work too. Hemingway often described a feeling of juice and said it was as bad as any disease. With this, quote, juice, Hemingway could produce massive amounts of truly masterful writing in very short amounts of time. His novel, The Sun Also Rises, is often seen as a masterpiece. Hemingway wrote this book in just 8 weeks. These were likely undiagnosed manic episodes. One of Hemingway's wives wrote that the protagonist of his depression was his liver. For virtually his entire life, Hemingway suffered from severe alcohol dependence. He likely began drinking as a teenager. After joining World War I in 1917, Ernest enjoyed cognac and whiskey with his friends and comrades. Hemingway was shot full of shrapnel during his service. While in treatment, bribed the hospital porter to smuggle cognac in on his behalf. For a young 20-something, this was not particularly alarming. But after his father's suicide, drinking became an everyday activity. He was eventually told by a doctor that his liver was failing. The doctor told Ernest to abstain from drinking, but the author was unable to follow this suggestion. Ernest's third wife left him because of his drinking. Shortly thereafter, a doctor wrote to Hemingway, "My dear Ernie, you must stop drinking alcohol. This is definitely of the utmost importance." Unfortunately, Ernest was never able to control his drinking. Today, researchers think that Hemingway's unceasing alcoholism permanently altered his brain chemistry, forcing open the faucet of psychosis towards the end of his life. Still, though, we are only scratching the surface of Hemingway's issues.
Hemingway.
In addition to the horrific mental issues that plagued Hemingway from birth, life presented him with a number of physical injuries. These most certainly had a significant effect on his overall mood, wellness, and even his brain chemistry. Hemingway was an ambulance driver in World War I. While delivering cigarettes to frontline trenches, a mortar exploded and sent 237 pieces of shrapnel into Hemingway's leg. While the medics were transporting him to a hospital on a stretcher, Hemingway's body was shot several times by enemy gunfire. After returning from the war to his home in Oak Park, Illinois, Hemingway's friends agreed that he had been wounded psychologically just as much as physically. Hemingway had been injured at nighttime in the war. For the rest of his life, he slept with a nightlight, saying that the darkness caused his soul to leap from his body. Hemingway was also terrified to sleep alone till the day he died. Likely due to his lifelong alcoholism, Hemingway was terrifically accident-prone. While living in Paris with his wife, Hemingway arose from bed at night and walked to the bathroom. He mistook the skylight cord for the toilet's flush box chain. Hemingway yanked on it and the entire skylight fell onto his head. He received a laceration that required 9 stitches and he was left with a scar on his forehead. In 1944, he was a passenger in a drunken car accident. He was not driving, but his body was sent through the windshield of the car, causing a concussion and a severe laceration. Less than 3 months later, he was thrown from a motorcycle in Normandy. This proved to be another traumatic brain injury. For several months afterward, he experienced tinnitus, headaches, slurred speech, blurred vision, and memory loss. In 1945, he was behind the wheel of his car in Cuba when the vehicle slid into an embankment. The metal rear-view mirror lacerated Hemingway's forehead. In 1950, Hemingway was on board his boat, the Pilar, when he slipped and fell. His head struck the deck of his boat, and he received yet another concussion. 4 years later, on safari in Africa, Hemingway experienced his worst brain injury. His plane crashed in Nairobi. Ernest sprained his back, his right arm, and his right shoulder. Thankfully, no one in his party was seriously injured, so they boarded a second plane, which also crashed. As the plane burned on the ground, Hemingway attempted to escape through the plane's door by battering it with his head. During this, he lacerated his scalp and fractured his skull. As he smashed his skull into the metal door, spinal fluid began to leak from his ear. The crash left him with temporary deafness, blurred vision, and serious injuries to his brain, liver, spleen, and kidneys. Altogether, throughout his life, Hemingway suffered from 6 traumatic brain injuries. Combined with alcoholism and a litany of mental disorders, Hemingway's problems are becoming very clear. All of these things happened in a world that, quite frankly, didn't give a shit. Mental health care was virtually non-existent in Hemingway's time. This is apparent in the fact that no doctors of the age were able to recognize Hemingway's symptoms or provide him with a diagnosis for any mental disorders. There are no records of any doctor conducting serious psychological tests on Ernest Hemingway. A person could put the blame on Hemingway himself. If you want a diagnosis, you need to go seek one, right? Well, Hemingway did see a number of doctors for physical ailments over the years, but the world in which he lived was very different than today's. To seek psychological help as a man in the early 20th century was simply unthinkable. It was to throw away your masculinity and dignity. Eventually, though, Hemingway agreed to see a psychologist at the Mayo Clinic. That doctor's solution was 10 rounds of electroconvulsive therapy. This therapy would ultimately lead to Hemingway's suicide.
Hell no.
Hemingway carried a lifelong fascination with suicide and death. His earliest short stories dealt with suicide quite heavily. Of his 7 completed novels, 5 end with the death of the male protagonist. After his father killed himself, that fascination seemed to only increase. In 1923, while living in Paris, he wrote to his creative collaborator Gertrude Stein, "I understand for the first time how men can commit suicide, simply because too many things in business piling up ahead of them that they can't get through." The following year, he made another remark about suicide in a letter to his friend Ezra. "I still claim that anyone that wants to can do it. Things are looking better, and I look forward to not giving a demonstration of my theory for some time." Years later, Hemingway wrote of suicide again in a letter to a friend. "Me, I like life very much. So much it will be a big disgust when I have to shoot myself. Maybe pretty soon, I guess." This was written decades before he shot himself. It seems like, on some level, Hemingway had already accepted or decided that his life would one day end in suicide. Perhaps his father's suicide had cemented the idea that it was always an option. Towards the end of his life, he began to talk more about suicide as he was increasingly losing his battle with depression. He wrote to a friend, "I'll tell you, Hotch, it's like being in a Kafka nightmare. I act cheerful like always, but I'm not. I'm bone-tired and very beat up emotionally." He openly brought up suicide with his doctors, who implored him to check into a psychiatric hospital. Initially, he refused. But in the final years of Hemingway's life, the author lived in extreme pain. Tremendous physical pain throughout his entire body, likely due to a then undiagnosed illness called hemochromatosis. Among the many symptoms of hemochromatosis, there is depression. It is likely that proper treatment for this illness would have also alleviated this depression. Hemingway was never diagnosed and never treated for hemochromatosis. At the Mayo Clinic, Hemingway experienced liver, heart, and kidney damage, diabetes, arthritis, and of course, deep and intense depression. It was here that he was given shock therapy. After receiving 10 rounds of this primitive treatment, Hemingway was discharged and seemed to be doing better, but his depression quickly returned, worse than ever. He could not summon the words to write, and would often break down in tears at his typewriter. Years of brain trauma, alcohol abuse, and now electroconvulsive therapy in a world that did not care or know how to handle him had robbed Hemingway of his greatest gift. The ability which had given him reason to live was now gone. In April of 1961, Hemingway's wife thwarted his first attempt at suicide when she found him loading a shotgun. He was hospitalized immediately. At the hospital, he asked to return home to pick up some personal items. Ernest was chaperoned to his home. When he arrived with his chaperones, he ran from them and got to his shotgun. As he turned the gun on himself, the chaperones caught up and wrestled the firearm away from Hemingway. Ernest Hemingway was transferred to the out-of-state Mayo Clinic again for another hospitalization. Halfway through the journey, the plane landed to refuel. Hemingway got out of the plane and tried to walk into the spinning propeller. The pilot cut the engine, thwarting Hemingway's third suicide attempt in 4 days. Around this time, Hemingway believed he was being followed by the FBI. His wife and those around him insisted these were just delusions of an insane man. In truth, years later, it would be revealed that the FBI had been monitoring Hemingway for decades. They had amassed a huge file on the author, who they believed to be a communist sympathizer. When he arrived at the Mayo Clinic, Hemingway received another round of electroconvulsive therapy. He was discharged days later. His wife feared that Ernest had charmed the doctors into believing he was sane. He was not well. Days after arriving back home, Ernest Hemingway woke up before his wife and shot himself in the head.
It's the ignition, I forget.
This is not all to say that Ernest Hemingway was a victim. He made a lot of really bad choices. He was a womanizer, an often terrible father, and an ego-obsessed liar. But I do believe we should look deeper than these labels. Whether we categorize Hemingway as a man's man who lived a life of adventure or an alcoholic misogynist, we are equally correct and incorrect. We should consider not just the who of Hemingway, but also the why and the how. We should carry some empathy and compassion into conversations about people, perhaps especially the dead, because they are not here to make their own case. To them, I believe we owe honesty. and manipulated over and over. It is almost impossible to distill effectively into a single sentence. The Übermensch is both apocalyptic and aspirational, both dangerous and comforting. If nothing else, it is powerful. For those feeling like they are lost in the forest of life, Nietzsche's Übermensch can provide, if not an escape route, some direction. That direction is to be fiercely, belligerently, violently independent. To truly be your own individual in a world so ready to crudely thrust every human being into some pre-existing classification. But this description defies the totality of the Übermensch. It is reductive. So let's explore the idea more meaningfully.
Untermensch.
A biographical work on Nietzsche would be its own pursuit. For our purposes, we will just say that he was a German-born philosopher active in the latter half of the 19th century. During this time, he developed the concept at hand, that of the Übermensch. But for its most true genesis, we can look to the ancient work of the Syrian writer Lucian, who discussed a hyperanthropos. This was a satirical version of some superhuman figure, which is not entirely irrelevant to Nietzsche. Even more direct is the link to Ralph Waldo Emerson's 1841 essay called The Oversoul. In this work, he presents the idea that the unified soul of humanity could ascend beyond the highest reaches of mankind. Emerson and Nietzsche are diametrically opposed in many ways, which has led researchers to often skip over this connection. But by Nietzsche's own admission, he saw Emerson as a spiritual brother. When commenting on a series written by Emerson, Nietzsche once said, "I have never felt so much at home in a book." While we can't really credit Nietzsche with the core idea of man surpassing mankind, his version is certainly the most significant incarnation, and of course it is the one we are discussing here. To do this, we can first try to dissect the word itself. The latter part of the word, Mensch, translates into English pretty easily. It is a person, a human, but the prefix Über creates issues in this context. Über translates as over, above, or beyond, so we would have above human, or something to that effect. But Nietzsche's Übermensch is human. He is in a way superhuman. So many scholars have chosen to translate the word as Superman. This worked reasonably well for a time. It describes a human who has transcended the existent version of humankind. But the Superman comic book character eventually became immensely popular. To avoid confusion, academics switched the English translation to Overman, which works, but really doesn't say much in itself as a word. To native English speakers, it just isn't very helpful. Ultimately, the word Übermensch is a German word, and I think we should just accept that. Certainly, I see no reason why it needs to be translatable or translated into English. Nietzsche's earliest incarnation of this concept seems to be found in an essay he wrote called On Moods in 1874. In this essay, he discusses the idea of elevated moods to be very reductive, a sort of natural high, something beyond our contemporary understanding of a good mood, certainly. In this work, he says that most people encounter these moods in durations of minutes and exist in a perpetual oscillation between high and low. But there exists a possibility that one could live entirely and permanently in this elevated state. History, Nietzsche ultimately admits, provides no actual examples of this, and it is just a fantasy. Nietzsche reached the conclusion of the Übermensch with his work Thus Spoke Zarathustra. This is written in the first-person perspective of its titular character, who is an all-seeing prophet. Against Nietzsche's belief that religion was dead as humanity's moral compass, Zarathustra provided a new roadmap for humanity. Within Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche expresses that mankind has great untapped potential. He says man in his present state, weighed down by his bad conscience, is truly a sick animal, but perhaps this condition is like pregnancy, a sickness heavy with future possibilities. Man is such an incomplete transitional creature that it almost seems as if nature had some future plans for him, as if man were not an end but only a way, an episode, a bridge, a great promise. Nietzsche himself never defines the Übermensch, but his framing does well to describe the concept. It is a destination that humanity can reach by collectively reassessing morals, methodology, and our definition of progress. Mankind in its present form is an obstacle that we must all overcome. History's mightiest figures, Caesar, Da Vinci, Napoleon, all fell short of the Übermensch, according to Nietzsche. While admirable, they too were to be destroyed and left in their proper place of obsolescence. In his time, there were a few sensibilities that Nietzsche rejected. One was nihilism, the belief that basically life has no inherent meaning. This is an interesting point because Nietzsche once described himself as a nihilist, and surface-level understanding of his work also points to that conclusion. This is one of the great, unfortunate, and probably unintentional tricks that Nietzsche performed. It is easy to read his work and find only negativity and hopelessness. In fact, the opposite is true. Nietzsche declared that the only way to destroy nihilism was to go through it, to embrace it in some sense. He could use nihilism to move past nihilism. By doing so, we could make life into a beautiful blank space. In this space, we could find and insert true fulfillment, an individualistic, unique happiness that was not bound to the ideas of others. In his time, then modern thinking sought happiness for all people based on Christian ideas of right and wrong. Nietzsche rejected this idea as well. He believed that the church had their chance to unify and improve humanity, but had spoiled it entirely. So Christianity, along with its dogmas, must also be rejected. Any and all isms were just boundaries to the radical, individualistic nature of the Übermensch. This higher version of man had broken free of rigid moral codes and societal expectations. He was perfectly free to be great. This new version of humanity was not something based in Darwinian evolution. It was not a flesh and blood new species, but instead a new paradigm of existence. It was also not any specific chosen one, or even population. The Übermensch is an idea. The idea that mankind must, can, and should develop beyond its current state, that there is simply something more we can achieve. The values that created present humanity, Nietzsche recognized, would just create more of the same. This is sound enough logic, so instead Zarathustra says humanity must develop an entire new system of values, with the end goal being the production of the Übermensch. Friedrich Nietzsche was inspired by the Greeks, who largely rejected the idea of equality. Nietzsche believed that nature had always and would always create beings who were greater than others. Some individuals were the dominant members of a species, while others were passive. With this in mind, Nietzsche strived for a society that embraced individuality. He believed the rejection of individuality was an existential threat to the human race, and he knew that individuality inherently meant inequality. Nietzsche rejected egalitarian ideas like liberal democracy and socialism. Religions, politics, and ideologies were an obstacle to the creation of perfectly free spirits. Likewise, the Übermensch would be himself detached from these herdish ways of thinking. He would be violently, radically free. To modern sensibilities, and those of his time, this could be taken as relatively extreme. But with Zarathustra, Nietzsche approaches the reordering of society with a degree of practicality. You see, it's easy to think that Nietzsche is saying we should swiftly and immediately cut down all that we know, but this is a misreading. Throughout his life, he expressed an understanding of the slow nature of social change. He pointed to the French Revolution, which he said would have been entirely different if cooler heads had prevailed. Any societal problem, Nietzsche says, is like a chronic illness. It develops from small habits repeated over and over. Nietzsche believes the cure must also come in this way, slow and steady. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, the prophet proclaims that moderation and courage are needed to achieve the Übermensch. In developing changes, we must avoid violent, sudden action, and instead we will live in the old way, while slowly taking in this new modality of existence. Eventually, these small drops of newness will fill our cups, and we will exist peacefully as something novel. Nietzsche calls for deep, meaningful change, not shallow, boisterous proclamations. When one's life or society at large is filled with purpose, we can walk slowly and be fulfilled by each small step. The fact remains, though, this change must be active. It must be ushered in by some people. So who will be those people? Nietzsche says that they must be both thinkers and men of action. They do not have to be enormously wealthy. In Nietzsche's new world, wealth will not be man's greatest aim. Nietzsche also rejects these men must be selected on the basis of race, and he further discounts the idea of aristocratic genealogy. The rulers across Europe, he said, were rife with corruption, and that would only continue. If anything, Zarathustra indicates the peasant class is more suited to the role. It is not where one comes from, but where one is going that is of the most importance. The, quote, aristocrats of intellect are also incapable of enacting this change. Studying is fine, but the people we seek must be capable of physical action. The true question is instead, how strong are you? And not just physically. To bring about this new world, Zarathustra demands people who are of great mind, body, and soul. These people should accept responsibility, master themselves, and be prepared to master others. While enormous wealth is not required, and these men need not be the richest in the world, Zarathustra says they must have the resources to grant themselves independence. They must be able to do what they want instead of what other people want them to do. This seems to be the importance of money in Nietzsche's system. The idea of love is strikingly relevant too. Zarathustra says these men must seek love not only out of passion or lust. They must master themselves and their urges. They must not seek to create children out of loneliness or discontent with oneself. Instead, the individual should wish to create people even greater than himself. Meanwhile, those who cannot be utilized for the advancement of humanity towards the Übermensch must be allowed to basically die out. It should be clear here, the men that Nietzsche is discussing are not themselves the Übermensch. They are instead the individuals who will lead society forward in a way that will eventually result in the realization of this concept. This new version of civilization will also require significant social conditions to exist, according to Zarathustra. The prophet declares that unfavorable conditions are ideal for eventually achieving the Übermensch. Nietzsche says that these humans of the future must have great spiritual and moral power, which can only...
Alright, I'm going to eat some goy schlop. Gonna wrap it up. See you tomorrow, maybe.